They said Cassian Valacrest broke a man's jaw once for using the wrong fork at his dinner table. They said he once rode back into a burning village not to save anyone, but to retrieve a land deed. They said the wolves in the Blackmere forest had learned, over 17 years, to howl differently when the Duke passed through. Lower, quieter, the way all living things learn to shrink around something that has never needed to be afraid. Every story about him ended the same way, with someone smaller walking away with less than they arrived with. But the one story nobody told, the one that lived only in the silence between the cold stone walls of his castle, was about the woman who slept 3 corridors away from him and whom he had not truly looked at in 4 years. That story was about to become the only one that mattered. The morning the bread riots reached Blackmere's eastern gate, Cassian was reviewing grain tallies. Not the riots, the tallies. He sat at the long oak table in his study, with the ledgers spread open before him like a surgeon's field, his quill moving in precise corrections across columns of numbers that his steward, Lord Aldrich Vane, had apparently miscalculated for the 3rd consecutive month. The sounds of the crowd outside, the shouting, the percussive rage of fists against iron, the particular pitch of human desperation that sits somewhere between screaming and weeping, filtered through the stone walls as ambient noise, like wind, like the grinding of mill wheels, background texture to the work. "They're at the eastern gate now, Your Grace," said Harwick, his captain of the guard, standing in the doorway with his helmet under one arm and his unease plainly visible. "Estimate 300, maybe more arriving from the outer villages." Cassian did not look up. "How many of ours on the wall?" 40, but the crowd is armed, sir. Farm tools, mostly. Some iron bars. There's a group in front that looks organized. Someone's been talking to them." "Someone's always been talking to them." He turned a page. "Position another 20 at the inner gate. If they breach the outer wall, hold the inner. Do not fire unless they fire." "And if they breach the inner, Your Grace?" Cassian finally looked up. His eyes, which were a particular shade of gray that people consistently struggled to describe accurately because gray was too simple a word for something that contained so little warmth, moved to Harwick with the unhurried attention of a man checking an item off a list. "Then we'll have 40 fewer rioters by morning and considerably more paperwork." He returned to the ledger. "Close the door." Harwick closed the door. Cassian was 41 years old. He had ruled Blackmere for 16 of those years, inheriting the northern duchy from a father whose legend was built on battlefield victories and whose private life had been an education in what men become when nobody ever told them the word enough. He had fought 2 border wars, suppressed 4 noble conspiracies, rebuilt the northern trade routes after they collapsed under the previous king's mismanagement, and had accumulated, in the process, a reputation that preceded him into rooms the way cold air precedes an open door. He was not cruel in the way that small men are cruel, finding pleasure in the suffering itself. He was something more efficient than that. He was indifferent. He had long ago concluded that most human suffering was the product of weakness, poor planning, or sentiment, and that the appropriate response to all 3 was removal of the offending variable. He had married Seraphina Elwyn 6 years ago, because the Elwyn family controlled 3 river ports essential to Blackmere's southern trade, and her father had been dying and desperate to secure his daughter's future. The marriage had been clean and logical. Cassian had attended the ceremony, signed the documents, and returned to work. He had fulfilled what he considered to be the reasonable obligations of a husband. He did not mistreat her, did not restrict her movements within the castle, ensured she had adequate staff and resources, and appeared beside her at the mandatory public functions where their union needed to be visibly demonstrated. He had done all of this with the same efficient detachment he applied to grain tallies and border disputes. That she might require something beyond the fulfillment of obligations had not, in 6 years, genuinely occurred to him. He was halfway through recalculating the 3rd quarter harvest projections when the sound outside changed. He had been listening to it the way you listen to weather, cataloging, assessing threat level, returning attention elsewhere. But something shifted in the texture of the crowd noise, and Cassian's hand paused above the ledger before his conscious mind had quite identified why. The shouting had stopped. Not diminished. Stopped. 300 people who had walked from frost-hardened villages with empty stomachs and iron bars, had gone quiet enough that he could now hear the wind moving through the ramparts. He waited. The silence held. Cassian set down his quill. He crossed the study to the narrow window that looked out over the eastern courtyard and pushed open the iron shutter. The air came in raw and smelling of early winter and smoke from the outer villages, and below him, past the second wall and the gate arch, he could see the edge of the crowd. Or rather, he could see that the crowd had reconfigured. The forward press of bodies against the gate had opened up. The mob, because that was what it had been, a mob, the specific geometry of collective fury, had rearranged itself into something that looked, from this angle, almost like an audience. He could not see what they were listening to. He pulled on his coat, told himself it was a security assessment, and went downstairs. By the time he reached the eastern gatehouse and climbed to the wall walk, the silence had given way to something else. Not shouting, not the grinding, rhythmic chanting he'd heard mobs use before. That percussive beat meant to work people's courage up past their fear. This was something quieter. People were speaking in the crowd, not to each other, responding to something. A voice he could not quite hear from inside the gatehouse. He moved to the embrasure and looked down. She was standing on the back of a supply cart that someone had positioned just outside the gate arch, close enough to the crowd that the nearest faces were 8 or 10 feet from her. She was wearing a plain wool traveling cloak, the dark green one he had seen draped over the chair in the corridor outside her rooms. With no jewelry visible and no attendants near her except one maid standing at the edge of the cart looking terrified. Her hair was not arranged. The wind had come in from the north and undone whatever it had been this morning, and it moved around her face in a way that would have been called disheveled on most women, and was, on her, simply something he had not seen before. She was talking to them, not at them, not the way nobles addressed crowds from height and distance. The voice, carrying authority, borrowed from architecture and ceremony. She was leaning slightly forward, her hands open at her sides, and she was talking to them the way you talk to people you are not afraid of and not dismissing, with the specific, focused attention of someone who actually intends to be heard and is also actually listening. He couldn't make out the words from here. He turned to the nearest guard. "Open the postern." The guard looked at him. "Your Grace, the crowd." "Open it." He went down through the postern gate and came around the base of the outer wall, keeping to the shadow of the gatehouse, close enough now to hear. "I know what the harvest reports say," she was saying. "I've read them. The northern yield was 40% below projection. The river mill at Crestfall collapsed in the August floods and hasn't been rebuilt. 3 of the Duke's own grain brokers have been filing false receipts for 6 months. She paused. "I know because I found the receipts." Cassian went very still. The crowd was quiet in a particular way. The way people go quiet when someone says something true they were not expecting to hear from that direction. An older man near the front, weathered face and the specific hunched posture of someone who had spent years doing physical labor in cold weather, called out, "What good does that do us? We're hungry now." "It means," Serafina said, "that the shortage is not inevitable. It was manufactured, and it can be corrected." She reached into the fold of her cloak and produced a document. "This is a written authorization, signed by me, directing the castle steward to release emergency reserves from the southern granary, enough for 2 weeks' rations for every household in the outer villages." She looked at the man who had spoken. "Your name?" A beat. The man looked at the people beside him, then back at her. "Doran Ash. Doran Ash. If you will come to the castle's eastern receiving gate at noon tomorrow, I will personally ensure the distribution is organized and supervised." She looked across the rest of the crowd. "I'm asking all of you to go home tonight, not because this situation is resolved, it isn't, but because you deserve better than a massacre. And right now, standing at this gate, that is the alternative being prepared for you inside these walls." The older man, Doran, stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "And why should we trust you?" She held his gaze. "You shouldn't, not yet. Trust is built on what happens tomorrow at noon." She paused. "I'll be there. I'm asking if you will be." The silence stretched. Then someone near the back of the crowd turned and started walking away from the gate. Then another. Then the specific physics of collective decision-making took over. The tipping point where the choice became less about courage and more about not being the one still standing there after everyone else had left. And within 4 minutes, the gate road was empty, except for the mud and the abandoned remnants of torches and the supply cart with the Duchess of Blackmere still standing on the back of it, watching the last of them go. Cassian stood at the base of the gatehouse wall and looked at her. She hadn't seen him. She was speaking quietly to her maid. Reassurance, from the look of it, the maid was shaking. And then she climbed down from the cart without assistance. Her boot finding the wheel spoke the way someone finds a familiar stair in the dark, and she picked up her cloak hem and turned toward the postern gate. She saw him. They stood 8 feet apart in the shadow of his own outer wall, with the smell of smoke and winter coming off the empty road, and for what might have been 4 seconds they simply looked at each other. Her face was not what he would have described it as before this moment. Before this moment he would have said, if asked, that she was fine-featured, quiet, adequately composed. He would have said it the way you describe furniture in a room you don't spend time in. What he saw now was something he did not have a word for that wasn't embarrassingly inadequate. She looked at him with a steadiness that was not defiance and not submission. Something rarer than either, the look of someone who has made a decision and is standing inside it. There was sweat at her temple. Her hands, at her sides, were very still. He noticed for the first time that they were ink-stained. 3 fingers of her right hand, faint but visible, the mark of someone who had spent real hours with documents. She spoke first. I released the Southern Granary reserves on my own authority. Her voice was level. I know you'll want to address that. Yes, he said. I will. She nodded once and walked past him through the postern gate. He stood there for a moment in the empty road after she had gone. Then he followed her inside. Shab. The confrontation happened in the east corridor outside the Great Hall because that was where he caught up with her, and Cassian was not a man who deferred difficulty to a more suitable location. Stop. She stopped, turned. You went outside the walls alone, he said, during an armed riot, without my authorization or knowledge, and you committed resources from the Southern Granary, resources that are allocated against the winter reserves, on your own written authority. He stopped 2 feet from her. Walk me through what possessed you to do any of that. I can walk you through the granary allocation, she said. Mathematically, the winter reserves have a surplus of roughly 18% against the projected need if the harvest shortfall holds. The emergency release I authorized is 11% of that surplus. We remain covered. That's not what I asked. You asked what possessed me. She looked at him directly. 40 families in the outer villages have children with visible signs of malnutrition. I know because I've been visiting the villages since August, on my own time, with no castle escort, because the situation on the ground reads very differently than the reports your steward submits. She paused. The riot wasn't spontaneous. 3 of your grain brokers have been skimming reserves for 6 months and selling them to private buyers in the south. I have the receipts. The anger at that gate was not irrational. It was accurate. Cassian looked at her. You've been visiting the villages since August, he repeated. Yes. Alone. With my maid, Bretta, who is not particularly large, as you may have noticed. Why didn't you come to me with this information when you found it? Something moved across her face, gone before he could name it clearly. Would you have listened? The corridor was cold. The torches in the iron sconces threw uneven light across the stone floor between them, and the silence that opened around her question was specific, not the silence of a woman who regretted asking, but of one who already knew the answer and had simply chosen to say it plainly. He didn't answer. I've submitted 4 written reports to your steward's office over the past 5 months, she said. 3 were returned with notations that the matter was under review. 1 was not returned at all. Her voice stayed level. I can show you the copies. I keep copies. You keep copies, he said. Of everything, Your Grace. I find it useful. She said it without heat, which was somehow worse than heat would have been. He had a framework for dealing with anger. He had made a study of it, professionally, because anger was a force you could redirect, exploit, exhaust. What she was deploying against him was not anger. It was precision, and it had the specific, uncomfortable quality of a surgical instrument being used correctly. The grain brokers, he said. Names. Fordham, Cray, and your steward's brother-in-law, a man named Pell, who isn't on any official roster but has been operating as a shadow broker since last winter. She reached into the fold of her cloak and produced a second document folded in quarters. This is a summary. The full evidence is in my sitting room. I assumed you would want to review it. He took the document, unfolded it, read the first page. The information was organized, specific, and damning. Not compiled in a hurry. This was the product of months of methodical work, cross-referenced dates, ledger notations, courier records. She had built a case the way lawyers build cases, the way people build things they intend to withstand scrutiny. How long have you been doing this? He asked. Working on this specific problem? Since February. She held his gaze. Working to make myself useful in whatever way I could, given the constraints of my situation? Since roughly the 3rd month of our marriage. The 3rd month. He looked at her. 6 years was 72 months, and she had been counting from the 3rd. He found, in that moment, that he did not know what to do with that information. It sat in the middle of his thinking like a stone in a shallow stream, present, unavoidable, disrupting the flow of everything he was moving through the space around it. I want the full evidence on my desk by morning, he said. It will be there. And the granary distribution tomorrow, you are not doing it alone. I'll send Harwick and 8 guards. 12, she said. The outer village road is unstable. I want people to see force restrained, not absent. He stared at her. 12 is better optics, she said. If you walk into a hungry crowd with 8 soldiers, it reads as insufficient commitment. 12 reads as presence without aggression. It matters how it reads. You've been thinking about crowd psychology. I've been thinking about a great many things, Your Grace. I have a lot of uninterrupted time. She said it simply, without visible bitterness, which meant the bitterness was there and had simply grown old enough to stop needing expression. He had been married to her for 6 years and had just now, in an east corridor by torchlight, met her for what felt like the first time, and the specific quality of that realization, the weight of what you find when you finally open a door you have been walking past for years, was something he was not equipped, in this moment, to process. 12 guards, he said. Fine, she nodded. Good night, Your Grace. She walked down the corridor. He watched her go. The straight back, the unhurried pace, the dark green cloak moving against the stone floor. And he stood there after she turned the corner for long enough that one of the page boys appeared from the far end of the hall, saw him standing alone in the empty corridor, and quietly reversed direction. Cassian unfolded the document in his hands and looked at it again. Pell. He knew Pell. Not well. A quiet man, unremarkable, who had materialized in the castle's orbit sometime in the past 2 years, and whom Cassian had registered and filed under inconsequential without further examination. His steward, Lord Aldrich Vane, had never mentioned a brother-in-law in the provisioning network. The ledgers in his study were still open on the table, the 3rd quarter harvest projections still underlined in his own corrections. He had spent the morning on numbers that, if her evidence was what it appeared to be, had been systematically falsified. He had spent the morning correcting arithmetic while the actual problem sat in a sitting room 3 corridors away in the hands of a woman he had not looked at in 4 years. He went back to his study. He read her summary twice. Then he sent for Harwick, quietly, and gave him 3 names and instructions that did not need to be loud to carry the appropriate weight. Then he sat in his chair and looked at the fire for a long time. Duchess. She had a sitting room that he had never been inside. He knew it existed the way you know rooms in a house you own but don't inhabit, abstractly, from floor plans and the occasional reference in a steward's report. He knew she spent time there. He knew she had books sent from the capital regularly, had a small writing desk, kept correspondence with her mother's sister in the eastern provinces. He knew these things the way you know facts about a place you have no particular reason to go. He stood outside the door at 7 the following morning, not because he needed the evidence. She had sent it to his desk at 5, exactly as promised, 3 volumes of meticulously organized documentation that his secretary had stacked with a note reading only from the Duchess. He had read them between 5 and 7 while the castle woke up around him, and they were, in his professional assessment, airtight. The case against Fordham, Cray, and Pell was complete. The The case against his steward, Aldrich Vane, for deliberate negligence at minimum and active complicity at likely, was equally constructed. He stood outside her door because he had read, in the third volume, a note she had apparently written to herself and left folded inside the back cover. Not to him, not to anyone, a private memo in her own handwriting with the date from 8 months ago. He was fairly certain she had not intended it to be included. He knocked. A pause. Then, "Come in." She was at the writing desk, already dressed, with a cup of something steaming and 3 documents open in front of her that she turned face down as he entered. The room was smaller than he'd expected, and fuller. Books stacked in the shelves and on the floor beside them. Maps pinned to the wall near the window with markings in red ink. A wooden tray on the side table with village names written on small cards. The fire had been burning long enough that the room was actually warm, which was not something he could say about most of the castle. She stood. "Don't," he said, meaning the formality of it, the standing. She sat back down slowly, with the watchfulness of someone calibrating an unfamiliar situation. He pulled the chair from near the window and sat down across from her without being invited, which he recognized even as he did it was not how a man enters a space he's been absent from for 4 years. He set the third evidence volume on the desk between them and opened it to the back cover. "This was inside," he said. She looked at the folded note for a moment without moving, and he watched something happen on her face that he had no name for in his existing vocabulary for people's expressions. Something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite resignation, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. She opened the note, read it, set it on the desk. "You weren't meant to see that," she said. "I know." What the note said, in her precise and very contained handwriting, was, "The harvest reports have been falsified for at least 14 months. Vane knows. The Duke does not, or does not care. I have been assuming does not know. I am beginning to suspect I am wrong about this. Either he does not know and is being deliberately kept ignorant by his own household, which suggests a loyalty problem of serious severity, or he knows and has decided it isn't worth his attention, which is worse. I keep looking at these numbers and thinking that someone who built Blackmere's trade recovery from nothing, using the same accounting methodology I'm now using to find this fraud, cannot possibly have missed it unless he stopped looking. I need to understand why he stopped looking, or I need to stop assuming it matters what he knows. She was looking at the far wall. "I built a case," she said, "for a year, not knowing if the person I was building it for would read it." She paused. "It was useful to put that somewhere." He sat with that for a moment. "I stopped looking," he said, "because I trusted Vane." "I know. I've trusted him for 11 years. He served my father." "I know that too." She looked at him. "People who served your father are not necessarily serving you. They're serving the version of the dukedom your father built, which is not the same thing as the one you actually have." He looked at her. "That's not a criticism," she said carefully. It's why I didn't come to you with this immediately. I wasn't certain whether the failure was Vane operating outside your knowledge or Vane operating exactly within it." She held his gaze with that particular directness again. "I needed to be certain before I brought it to you, because if I'd been wrong about which one it was—" She stopped. "If you'd been wrong," he said, "you'd have accused your own husband's most trusted man of fraud, based on preliminary evidence. And the consequences of that for you would have been significant." She didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. He had spent 11 years with Aldrich Vane. He had spent 11 years developing a sense of the man's competence and loyalty, relying on his assessments of the duchy's condition, treating his reports as the ground truth against which Cassian made decisions. And in the same period, an arm's length away in the same castle, his own wife had been quietly doing the actual accounting. Not as his spy, not as his agent, but alone, on her own initiative, to protect a place she had no reason to feel belonged to her. "The note," he said. "You wrote that you needed to understand why I stopped looking. What did you conclude?" A long pause. "I concluded that you built Blackmere's recovery by deciding what was worth your attention and what wasn't," she said. "And that somewhere in that process, the castle itself, the internal machinery, the people inside the walls, stopped making the cut. She paused. I concluded that you managed threats very well, and that you'd stopped seeing the household as capable of producing them. And me, he said, what category did I fall into? Worth the attention or not? She was quiet for a moment. You fell into a category I didn't have a name for, she said finally. I kept starting a box for you and finding it didn't fit. He looked at her, and he had the very specific, disorienting experience of understanding that he had been living inside a story he thought he knew the shape of, and discovering it had a different shape entirely. That the woman 3 corridors away who had been background noise for 4 years had been, in actual fact, running a parallel operation with more rigor and more loyalty than anyone he paid. The distribution at noon, he said. I'll attend. She blinked. I'll attend. Harwick will be there and the 12 guards you requested, but I'll be present. He paused. I want Dor and Ash to look at the Duke and the Duchess standing together when the grain is distributed. It will matter how it reads. You said that. A beat. I did. You were right. He stood. I'll have Vane detained by morning, quietly. Fordham and Cray within the week, before they have time to learn that Vane is in custody. He looked down at the volumes on her desk. There will be arrests and a trial and a considerable amount of disruption to the Northern trade structure as we dismantle the network they built. I'll need someone who understands the evidence to be present for the review process. He paused. That would be you. She looked at him steadily. I know the evidence better than anyone. Yes, he said. You do. He moved toward the door, then stopped, because there was one more thing, and he had not yet decided whether to say it, and was apparently deciding now, in real time, which was not characteristic of him. The note, he said without turning. You wrote that you kept looking at the numbers and thinking that someone who built Blackmere's recovery from nothing couldn't have missed this. That you needed to understand why I stopped looking. He paused. The answer is that I thought I'd already built the thing. I thought the work was done. He looked at the door. I was wrong about that. Silence. Yes, she said. You were. He left. The noon distribution was attended by 230 people. Cassian stood at the eastern receiving gate in plain riding clothes, no armor, no ceremonial dress, the deliberate choice of someone who had thought about how it would read, and watched Seraphina work. There was no other word for it. She moved through the distribution line with the systematic efficiency of someone who had organized this in her head many times before it was real, speaking to each person by name where she knew the name, asking questions when she didn't, noting things in a small book her maid carried. She had brought 3 of the castle kitchen staff to supervise the measurement and packaging of the rations, and she had somehow also arranged for a local physician from the outer village to be present, quietly, near the back of the line, for families that needed more than grain. Doran Ash came through the line. He was third from the end, the position of a man who had arrived early and spent the intervening time watching. He took his allocation without speaking. Then he stopped and looked at Seraphina. You were here, he said. I said I would be, she answered. He looked at Cassian. Cassian held the man's gaze. There was a particular kind of assessment in the look. The measuring a man does when he is trying to decide whether something that presents as a fact is actually true, or whether the fact is a performance with truth wearing its coat. Cassian was accustomed to being looked at this way, had spent 20 years learning to return such looks without softening them, because softening them was what weak men did. He did not soften it. But he also, for reasons he wasn't examining in real time, did not deploy the specific quality of dominance he normally would have, the weight that ended the inspection and reminded the inspector of relative standing. He simply met Doran Ash's eyes and let the man look. Ash turned back to Seraphina. There'll be more people next week who need help, he said. Not just the villages on this road. There's a cluster east of the mill ruins. 40 families, maybe. Some of them worse off than us. I know about them, Seraphina said. I'm going there Friday. Ash looked at her for a moment longer. Then he tucked his allocation under his arm and walked away. Harwick appeared at Cassian's shoulder. That's the last of the line, Your Grace. Distribution complete. Cassian watched the remaining people moving away down the gate road, the specific unhurried departure of people who had gotten what they came for and had, perhaps unexpectedly, not been degraded in the getting of it. He watched Serafina close her small book and say something to her maid, and then stand for a moment looking at the empty road. He had ruled this duchy for 16 years. He had built its trade recovery and suppressed its rebellions and managed its politics with a consistency and competence that had made Blackmere one of the more stable territories in the Northern Empire. He had done all of it. He now saw with a clarity that had the unpleasant quality of arriving too late, by treating the duchy as a system to be managed rather than a place where people were hungry and cold and capable of loyalty if someone extended them the basic dignity of being present when they came for help. She had understood that without being taught it. He had been the Duke for 16 years and she had understood it in less than 4. The guards began moving back toward the gate. Serafina turned from the road and found him standing 6 feet away, watching her. And something moved briefly across her face, surprise almost at being watched rather than overlooked, before she composed it back into the steady expression he was beginning to realize was not her natural state, but her defensive one. The face she wore when she expected to be assessed and found insufficient. "You organized a physician," he said. "3 children in the village had symptoms that aren't hunger alone. I didn't want them to come all the way here and not see someone useful." "You organized this before you knew I'd be here?" "Yes." "You would have done it exactly the same way without me." She paused. "Yes." He nodded, slowly. "Good." She looked at him. "Not good that I wasn't here," he said. "Good that you didn't build it around whether I'd be here." He paused. "That's the right way to build things." The look on her face was brief and carefully managed and entirely unguarded for exactly 2 seconds before she collected it. And in those 2 seconds it was the look of someone who had not been told, in a very long time, that the way they were doing something was right. He turned back toward the gate before he could examine what that cost him to see. What? The arrests were clean. Aldrich Vane was detained in his private office at 6 in the morning, 3 days after the distribution, by Harwick and 4 guards. He denied everything for approximately 4 minutes, which was how long it took Harwick to open the first of Serafina's evidence volumes to the page marked with a ribbon and set it on the desk. After that, Vane was quiet for a different reason. Fordham and Cray were picked up on the same morning before either could receive word of Vane's detention. The shadow broker Pell attempted to leave Blackmere on the southern road before dawn and was stopped at the checkpoint 3 miles from the castle by a junior guard who had been specifically briefed on his physical description. Word spread through the castle with the specific speed of news that confirms what people had suspected. Cassian received 5 separate requests for private audience from noble household members within 24 hours, each phrased with the careful hedging of people repositioning themselves relative to a change in landscape. He ignored them all temporarily and had his secretary draft a public statement to be posted in the main hall and the outer village gates. The fraud had been discovered through internal investigation. The perpetrators were in custody. An independent review of all provisioning records for the past 2 years would commence immediately. He did not name the source of the investigation. She had not asked him to name it. Had not, as far as he could tell, sought credit for it in any form. When the castle began to redistribute Vane's administrative duties and reorganize the provisioning office, she appeared in the doorways of the relevant meetings, contributed what was needed, and disappeared again. He watched her doing this and thought, with the private discomfort of a man examining a blind spot he'd just learned he had, that she had developed the ability to be invisible inside her own home. Not because she lacked presence, he now understood that clearly enough, but because invisibility had been, for a long time, the only safe way to move. He had not made her feel safe. He had been absent long enough that she had optimized for his absence. The realization sat in him for several days, uncomfortable in the specific way of realizations that require you to reassess a long period of choices rather than a single one. He found himself in that week noticing the ink stains on her right hand, the small leather book she carried, the specific way she listened in the brief exchanges they had about the investigation, fully present, tracking not just what was said, but what was not said, the way someone listens who has spent years making do with incomplete information. He had been married to her for 6 years and had not known she listened like that. He was beginning to accumulate a list of things he had not known, and the list had a quality he was unaccustomed to. It made him feel ignorant, not of the duchy, not of its economics or politics, but of something that had been present in the same building for 6 years and to which he had extended approximately the same quality of attention as the tapestries in the East Corridor. The letter arrived from the capital on a Friday, 3 weeks after the bread riots. It was delivered to him by his new secretary, a young man named Orrin, who had replaced Vane's functionary and who had not yet learned to bring him bad news the way experienced staff learned to bring it, quietly, with appropriate advance preparation of the environment. Orrin simply handed him the letter with the crown seal pressed in gold wax, said, "From His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, Your Grace, arrived this morning," and stood there. Crown Prince Lucian Aldrath, 29 years old, recently returned from a 2-year diplomatic tour of the Eastern Territories, publicly credited with negotiating a significant reduction in border tensions that had cost the Empire 40,000 soldiers over the previous decade. Smart, popular, and, unlike most princes Cassian had encountered, not a fool. He had met Lucian twice in formal settings at the capital, and assessed him as someone who had learned the skill of being charming without being transparent, which was the more dangerous variety. He opened the letter. The bulk of it was diplomatic, a tour of the northern territories Lucian was undertaking, acknowledgement of the recent troubles in Blackmere and the restoration of order, expressions of confidence in the Duke's management of the situation. The last 2 paragraphs were not diplomatic. In them, Crown Prince Lucian expressed that during his tour he had heard, with considerable interest, about the circumstances of the bread riots resolution and the subsequent exposure of the provisioning fraud. He wrote that he had heard specifically from sources in the outer villages, from travelers, from the letters of merchants who had witnessed the noon distribution, about the role of the Duchess of Blackmere in both. He wrote that he found this extraordinary and that he was very much looking forward, on the occasion of his stay at Blackmere Castle, which would begin in 12 days' time, to meeting her properly. He was looking forward, he wrote, to meeting her properly. Cassian read that sentence twice. Then he set the letter on his desk and looked at the fire for a long moment. 12 days. The Crown Prince of the Empire would arrive in Blackmere in 12 days, having heard the story of Seraphina calming a mob and exposing a fraud network single-handedly, and would walk into this castle looking forward to meeting her properly. And what would he find? He would find a woman who had been, for 4 years, the most invisible person in a castle she technically ruled, and who had, in 3 weeks, demonstrated a quality of intelligence and moral clarity that would read to a young, ambitious crown prince as exactly the kind of extraordinary he was clearly disposed to find attractive in the political romantic sense that princes deployed when they wanted something. Cassian knew the type. He had been the type, once, in a different life. What Lucian would find, when he arrived, was a woman who should have been this duchy's greatest asset for 6 years, and had instead been filing reports with the steward who buried them, visiting dying villages alone with a frightened maid, keeping copies of everything because she had learned not to trust that anyone would listen. What Lucian would find was a failure of Cassian's making walking around in a green wool cloak that still caught the wind the way it had outside the eastern gate, and the crown prince would have the advantage, the catastrophic, irretrievable advantage, of arriving 12 days from now with fresh eyes and the full appreciation of someone who had not already spent 6 years failing to see her. Cassian stood up. He needed to think, and he thought best when he was moving, and the East Corridor was where his feet took him before he'd made a decision about it. Past the torches, past the tapestries, to the door of the sitting room with the maps on the wall and the fire that was always burning. He knocked. "Come in," she said, and when he opened the door, she was at the desk with the small leather book open and 3 village maps spread in front of her, and she looked up at him with the expression she wore when she was not sure whether this was a good visit or a bad one. He held up the letter. "The Crown Prince is coming," he said, "in 12 days. He's heard about you." She looked at the letter without moving for a moment. Heard about the riots, the distribution, the fraud exposure. He set the letter on the corner of her desk. "He writes that he is looking forward to meeting you properly." She read the letter. He watched her face while she read it, and what he saw was not vanity, not the flush of being recognized, but something more complicated, more guarded, the face of someone calculating implications, She set the letter down. "What do you need from me?" she asked. It was, he thought, the most Serafina thing she could have said. The immediate, unsentimental cut to what was required of her. The instinct of someone who had spent years making herself useful against the possibility of being needed. He stood across the desk from her in the warm room with the maps and the books and the fire, and he looked at her for a moment with the specific, accumulating, deeply inconvenient awareness that what he needed from her and what he had been failing to provide to her were, in fact, the same thing. And that in 12 days, unless something changed in this cold castle, a prince was going to walk in and see it before he did. "I don't know yet," he said, which was the first honest thing he had said to her in 6 years of marriage. And that was when they heard the first alarm bell from the northern watchtower. 2 short rings and 1 long, which was the signal they hadn't used in 4 years, the signal that meant the northern mountain road was no longer safe. Someone was coming, and from the cadence of the bell, ringing again now, urgent and cold in the night air, they were coming fast, and they were not friendly. The bell rang again, 2 short, 1 long, the pattern that meant organized threat on the northern approach, not a border skirmish, not a lost merchant convoy, something that had been seen, assessed by the watchtower guard, and judged worth waking the castle for at 9 in the evening. Cassian was already moving before the 3rd sequence finished. "Stay here," he said, not looking back at her. Cassian. He was already through the door. The north watchtower was 4 minutes at a run from the sitting room corridor, and he covered it in 3, taking the tower stairs 2 at a time, with Harwick materializing at his shoulder somewhere on the 2nd landing, the way Harwick always materialized when bells rang, out of the walls, apparently, already armored, already holding a torch. The tower guard, a young man named Seth, whose voice still cracked under pressure, was pointing north along the mountain road. "Riders, Your Grace, 8, maybe 10, moving hard. They passed the 3rd marker post 6 minutes ago. Colors? No colors, black traveling cloaks. Armed? Can't tell yet. But the horses—" Seth stopped. "The horses are running like something's behind them, sir." Cassian took the spyglass. He looked north along the road that cut through the lower pass, white with early frost in the moonlight, and found the riders. 8 of them. Moving at the specific, dangerous pace of people who were not riding towards something but away from it. That lean forward, don't-stop quality that horses carry when their riders are frightened and the fear has moved down the reins. "Open the main gate," he said. "Get me 20 armed men in the outer yard. Now." He went down. The riders came in hard through the main gate, with their horses blowing steam, and one of them, the second from the left, a heavy-set man in a black cloak, already listing sideways in the saddle with a crossbow bolt in his left shoulder. The others pulled up in the outer yard in the specific controlled chaos of people who had been riding hard and were now making themselves stop, and Cassian walked out into the torchlight and looked at them. He recognized the crest on the nearest horse's saddle blanket 2 seconds before the lead rider pulled back his hood. Lord Edric Morn, Baron of Ashfin, one of the 3 eastern barons who held the road passes between Blackmere and the imperial capital. 50 years old, known for measured judgment and a reliable allegiance that had lasted through 2 regime transitions. His face, in the torchlight, was the face of a man who had been frightened recently and was managing the aftermath of it with the specific tight-lipped efficiency of someone who does not permit himself to look frightened after the fact. "Morn," Cassian said. "Talk." "Inside," Morn said. "Not here." Maul. They were in the war room within 10 minutes. Cassian, Harwick, Morn, and 2 of Morn's surviving guard who had been in the attack and could speak to the specifics. The man with the bolt in his shoulder was in the castle physician's care. The other 6 riders were in the outer guard room with food and water and very specific instructions not to speak to anyone. Morn's traveling party had been 31 people when they left the capital 8 days ago. They were 9 now. He said it flatly, without preamble, the way people say facts they have not yet finished turning into something they can carry. 22 people dead on the Ashfin Mountain Pass in an ambush that had, by Morn's account, been planned. Not opportunistic bandits, not border raiders. Professional. Multiple points of attack, cut off positions on both sides of the pass, and a specific tactical choice to kill the guards first and attempt to take Morn alive. They weren't trying to rob you, Cassian said. No. What were they trying to take? Morn looked at him. I was carrying correspondence. Personal correspondence, not official dispatches. Letters between myself and 3 other Eastern barons regarding certain positions on the question of the Northern Succession Review. The Northern Succession Review. The question that had been quietly moving through the Empire's upper halls for 8 months. What happened to the Northern Duchies if Cassian died without an heir, given that Blackmere controlled the primary trade routes between the capital and the Eastern territories, and given that the current structure of those trade routes was enormously advantageous to certain factions and enormously disadvantageous to others. Who knew you were carrying those letters? Cassian said. 4 people, not counting the barons themselves. Morn paused. One of them is dead on the pass, and the others are why I'm here rather than going to the capital. Cassian looked at Harwick. Harwick looked at the wall with the expression of a man doing math he doesn't enjoy. Then Cassian looked back at Morn and let the silence work for a moment, because silence was useful when a man needed to decide whether he was going to tell you everything or just the part he'd rehearsed. Morn told him everything. The letters, when summarized, amounted to a coalition of Eastern barons positioning to support a formal petition to the Crown requesting that Blackmere's Northern Trade Authority be restructured, redistributed, in the event of a succession gap, which was a political way of saying they were planning to carve Blackmere up if Cassian didn't produce an heir and the Crown needed to renegotiate Northern alliances before Lucian's ascension formalized the current arrangement permanently. The ambush, by Morn's reading, was not a random act of violence against a traveling party. It was someone making sure those letters never reached the capital. Someone who either supported the redistribution plan and didn't want the conspiracy documented, or opposed it and didn't want the information to reach the wrong ears. Either way, 22 people were dead on a mountain pass, and someone with access to private correspondence at a level that implied either a very highly placed source or a very well-funded network had arranged it. Cassian looked at the map on the war room table. The Northern Pass. The road that ran south from it toward Blackmere. The roads that branched east and west toward the other baronies. You need to stay here, he said, not as a guest, as a protected witness. No correspondence in or out until we understand the network. Morn looked like he wanted to argue, and then looked at Cassian's face and decided not to. Understood. Harwick. Double the watchtower rotations. I want the northern and eastern roads watched continuously, not on schedule. He paused. And I want the Crown Prince's route reviewed. He's arriving in 11 days. If someone is moving against the Eastern Alliance structure, his travel corridor matters. I'll send a private rider to his advance guard, Harwick said. Tonight. Fahm. He did not return to her sitting room that night. There was too much to manage. The security review, Morn's accommodation, the war room maps that needed updating, 3 separate consultation meetings with Harwick and the new head of provisioning that ran past midnight. He worked until the castle was quiet and then worked another 2 hours in the study alone, because that was how he had always worked, and it had always been sufficient. At 2 a.m, he sat back from the desk and realized his shoulder hurt. Not from injury. From the specific tension of holding himself at high alert for 5 consecutive hours, the physical cost of sustained focus that he had trained himself over 20 years to not register until it registered all at once. He rolled his neck. The fire in the study had burned low and the room was cold, and he was, in the specific, private way he never allowed himself to be in front of other people, tired. He thought about Serafina. He thought about her not as a political consideration, not the question of Lucien and the 12 days and the letter she'd read without flinching, but as something more immediate and less organized than that. He thought about the moment in her sitting room when he'd said, "I don't know yet," and the way she'd looked at him, and the particular quality of that moment that had been interrupted by bells. He had not said an honest thing to her since the early years, when even the honest things had been functional rather than personal. He had said, "This is required of you, and this is how the household runs, and your father's ports are now part of Blackmere's southern network, and this is what the marriage contract specifies." He had said all the things that were technically true, and none of the things that were actually true, And she had built a life inside the space his absence created, and she had filled it with maps and evidence volumes and village visits and ink stains, and he had walked past the door for 4 years. He did not know what to do with that. He understood systems. He understood force, the application of it, the management of it, the specific calculus of when to use it, and when its restraint was more powerful than its use. He had built a reputation for 16 years on the architecture of controlled power, and it had served him well, and it had made him, somewhere in the building of it, into someone who had optimized for outcomes at the cost of the kind of attention that wasn't strategically useful. He had looked at Serafina and found insufficient strategic utility and had, accordingly, looked elsewhere. And now the crown prince of the empire was 11 days away and had been told stories about her from people who had stood at an eastern gate and received grain from the duke's wife's hands, while the duke himself had been inside reviewing tallies. Cassian stood up. He went to the window, looked out at the dark castle yard, the torches, the frost on the stone. Somewhere in the east wing, behind a door he had not knocked on enough times to have worn a habit into it, she was either sleeping or still at her desk with the maps, and she had spent the evening either waiting to hear what the alarm was about or not waiting, having decided not to expect information. He suspected she had not waited. He suspected she had gone back to her maps. The thought had an edge to it he didn't examine. Boss, he told her in the morning. Not everything. Not the succession review implications, not the full scope of the political threat the ambush represented, but the basic facts. Morn, the attack, the casualties, the need for heightened security. He told her in the corridor outside the East Hall because that was where he encountered her at 7 in the morning, and he did not defer it because deferring it was what he would have done before, and she had made clear, the night before last, what she thought of information management. She listened without interrupting. Her face did the thing he was beginning to recognize, the narrowing assessment, the specific quality of attention that was not passive reception but active processing, the ink-stained hand very still at her side. 22 people, she said, when he finished. Yes. On the pass. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Who else knows Morn is here? My immediate household, Harwick. The gate guards who were on duty last night. Someone in the capital knows, she said. Someone who had access to private correspondence at the Baron level. That's a very short list of people. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at him. You're thinking about Lucian's route. He stopped. How? Because the Crown Prince traveling through the eastern passes in 11 days is the most significant security consideration this ambush creates, she said. Someone who moves against the Eastern Alliance structure the week before the Crown Prince begins his northern tour is either very confident or very reckless. She paused. Or both. He looked at her for a moment. I want you to stay inside the castle walls until this is clearer, he said. I have village visits scheduled for Friday. Cancel them. Her chin lifted very slightly. Those families are not worth your life on the Eastern Road if someone is moving against Blackmere's people and alliances. He held her gaze. Cancel them. Have your physician go in your name. I'll send an escort. He paused. This is not a request. She held his gaze for 3 seconds that were very loud in the way silence gets loud when two people are measuring each other. Then she said, I'll need to send letters explaining the postponement. Through Harwick's office. Everything in and out goes through Harwick until further notice. Understood. She paused. I want to speak with Lord Morn. No. He'll have information about the village conditions in the Eastern Territories that my maps don't. Serafina. He said her name the way he hadn't said it in months, directly, without the formal distance of your grace or the impersonal neutrality of everything else. And she stopped. Morn is a protected witness in an active security situation. Until I know the shape of the network that killed 22 of his people, I am limiting his contact to essential personnel. He held her gaze. You are not expendable. Act accordingly. She looked at him. The thing that moved across her face was careful and fast, and he caught it anyway. The specific, almost involuntary reaction of someone who has been told you are not expendable for the first time in long enough that they don't know where to put it. All right, she said quietly. He nodded once and turned toward the war room. The days that followed had the specific compressed quality of a castle on alert. Shorter nights, sharper attention, every door that opened and closed logged in Harwick's records. Morn was installed in the secure guest suite with 2 guards outside and his correspondence suspended. His surviving men were interviewed individually in the East Guard room, their accounts cross-referenced against the geography of the pass. Cassian moved through it all with the efficient, sleepless concentration that emergencies required of him, and in the margins of it, in the moments between war room meetings and security reviews, he found himself doing something that was not efficient and not strategic. He was watching her, not surveilling, watching. The specific, involuntary quality of attention that turns toward something because it wants to, not because there's a reason. He watched her move through the castle corridors with her small leather book. He watched her manage the household routines that had continued regardless of the security situation. The staff meetings, the provisioning records, the quiet, steady maintenance of a castle's daily life that he had never paid attention to because it had never failed. He watched her eat at the far end of the dinner table with the composed self-sufficiency of someone who had learned not to expect company, and he felt the weight of that composure the way you feel a sound you've been not hearing suddenly register. She did not ask him for anything, did not push at the limits he'd placed on her movements, did not, as far as he could tell, adjust her behavior in any way to account for his increased attention, which was, he understood with the cold precision he applied to everything, the response of someone who had learned not to build anything around whether he was paying attention. On the 4th day, he sat down across from her at breakfast. She looked up from her documents. She did not say anything. "The northern road is clear to the 2nd marker," he said. "Harwick's patrol confirmed it this morning." "Good." She looked back at her document. "The physician you sent to the eastern villages," he said. "His report came back. The children you flagged are improving." She stopped. Didn't look up immediately. Then, "All 3?" "All 3. She looked up then, and what was in her face for that single unguarded moment was something he had no framework for because it was purely personal, not strategic, not composed, not the managed surface she presented to a castle that had learned to see her as the Duke's quiet wife. It was the face of someone for whom those 3 children had been real and present and worrying, and who was now feeling the specific physical relief of worry resolved. It lasted about 2 seconds before she collected it. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You should have been told yesterday. Oren sat on the report. He's new. He doesn't know what I want to know yet." "Tell him," Cassian said. "Specifically, make a list of what you want to know and tell him. You should not be the last person in this castle to hear about things that fall under your concern." She looked at him for a moment. "I've been managing that myself," she said carefully. "You've been working around gaps that I should have closed." He looked at her directly. "I'm telling you to stop working around them. Tell Oren. Tell Harwick. Tell me." He paused. "The information goes both directions now. I need to know what you know when you know it." The silence that followed had a texture to it, not hostile, not wary, but the specific, careful quality of a person recalibrating their understanding of what was available to them. She had spent years optimizing for absence, and he was now telling her the absence was over, and she was looking at him the way someone looks at a door that has been locked for a long time and is now standing open, and the reasonable response is to wonder what changed and why, and whether it will be locked again tomorrow. "All right," she said, for the 2nd time in 4 days, in the same quiet voice. He picked up his coffee. She went back to her documents. They sat in silence at the long breakfast table in the morning light, and it was not the silence of 2 strangers or the silence of a political arrangement being efficiently maintained. It was something else. Something that did not have a name yet but was taking up space in the room. Toked. On the 7th day, a 2nd letter arrived from the capital. This one was not from Lucien. It was from the Imperial Intelligence Office, the formal body, not the informal network. And it was addressed to Cassian in the official cipher they used for sensitive security correspondence. He decoded it in his study with the door locked. The attack on Morn's party had been confirmed as a coordinated assassination attempt. The Imperial Office had identified 3 of the attackers from descriptions provided by Morn's survivors. 2 were known contract killers operating out of the capital's underworld. The third was a former Imperial Guard who had been dismissed 14 months ago for undisclosed conduct violations. Former Imperial Guard, which meant the network that had planned this attack had connections inside the palace itself. The letter's final paragraph was brief and precise. The Imperial office had reason to believe Blackmere was not the sole target of the destabilization effort. The Crown Prince had been advised of the security situation. His arrival was proceeding as scheduled. He had declined to delay. Of course he had declined. Cassian set the letter down. Lucien declining to delay his arrival after an intelligence briefing about coordinated attacks on the Eastern Alliance structure was either very brave or very calculated, and from everything Cassian knew of the man, it was probably both simultaneously. A prince who showed up anyway, who walked into the destabilized Northern Territory on schedule, sent a specific message to every baron and duke watching. The crown does not flinch. It was good politics. It was also the move of a man who was very confident in his own security. 4 days. Cassian looked at the map on his study wall, the Northern Pass, the Eastern Road, Blackmere, at the center of it, the fortress that had been a fortress for 300 years and that now had a duchess who visited villages alone and an intelligence network running out of a sitting room with ink-stained maps. He thought about the letter Lucien had sent, the last 2 paragraphs, looking forward to meeting her properly. He thought about Serafina sitting at the breakfast table this morning with her documents, the 2 seconds of unguarded relief on her face when he told her about the children, the specific quality of her going back to her work afterward as though she wasn't sure the warmth was allowed to last. He thought about what Lucien would walk in here and see in 4 days, and what he would think, and what he was clearly already disposed to think based on what people had been telling him about a woman who had been invisible inside her own home. Cassian looked at the map for a long time. Then he stood up, left his study, walked down the east corridor and knocked on the door of the sitting room for the 3rd time in 8 days, which was more times than he had knocked on it in the previous 4 years. She opened the door. Behind her, the maps, the fire, the warm room. "I need to speak with you," he said. "About Lucien." She stepped back and let him in. He came inside and looked at her standing in the warm light of her own room, and what he felt, beneath the strategy and the security calculus and the 16 years of learning how to make himself impervious to the specific weakness of wanting, was something he had no precedent for managing, something that had been building in the margins of 8 days of attention and was now simply present in him like a current, quiet and strong, and not remotely convenient. He opened his mouth to say something measured and political about the Crown Prince's arrival, and instead said, "I owe you an apology." She went very still. "Not for a single thing," he said. "For a pattern." He looked at her directly, because looking away would have been cowardice, and he was not a coward in any arena except this one, and he was done with that exception. "You spent 6 years building something in this castle that I should have built with you, and I was absent for it. Not absent in body, absent in the way that's worse, present, and not seeing." He paused. "I saw you 10 days ago, for the first time, and I have been trying to work out since then what that means." The silence in the room was total. She was looking at him with the expression of someone who has heard something they were not prepared for and is not yet sure whether it is safe to respond to honestly, and he watched her make the decision in real time. Watched the calculation run across her face, the old instinct to manage it safely, and then the choice to not. "It means," she said very quietly, "that you are 4 years late." "Yes," he said, "I know. And I don't know what to do with that, Cassian." His name in her mouth was not a formality and not an accusation. It was something more dangerous than either. It was a person speaking to him as a person, without the architecture of titles and distance that had been the structure of 6 years. He crossed the room. He stopped 2 feet from her, which was closer than he had stood in months, close enough that he could see the ink on her right hand and the tiredness under her eyes that the last 8 days had put there, and the very specific quality of her looking at him. Not up, not with the deference he'd become so accustomed to that he'd stopped registering it, but level, direct. A woman who had decided sometime in the last 10 days that she was done optimizing for his absence. "Neither do I," he said, "but I'm not leaving you to figure it out alone." She looked at him for a long moment. Then the door to the sitting room opened. Harwick, fast footsteps, no knock. And Harwick came in 3 steps with a face that Cassian had seen twice in 16 years, and both times meant that something had gone wrong in a way that could not be undone. "Your Grace," Harwick looked at Cassian. "The Crown Prince's advance guard just arrived at the outer gate." He paused. "His Highness is with them." Cassian turned. "He's 4 days early." "Yes, sir." Harwick's jaw was tight. "And he came in from the western road, not the northern pass." A beat. "Sir, there are people dead on the northern pass. His Royal Highness's route was meant to be northern." Cassian looked at him. "Someone told him to change his route," Harwick said, "after he left the capital." The fire cracked in the quiet room. Serafina was very still behind him. Someone with access to the Crown Prince's private travel itinerary had redirected him away from a road where assassins were waiting, and that same someone had not warned Morn's party in time. Which meant the person protecting Lucien and the person who had allowed 22 people to die on the pass were not the same person. Which meant this response didn't load. Try again. Which meant there were 2 networks. Cassian stood in Serafina's sitting room with Harwick in the doorway and felt the shape of it assemble in his mind the way tactical problems assembled, not gradually, but all at once, the pieces falling into their positions with the cold finality of a lock engaging. Someone had known about the ambush on the northern pass and had used that knowledge to save Lucien, while letting Morn's party walk into the kill zone. That was not an accident or an oversight. That was a choice. Someone had decided that the Crown Prince was worth protecting and that 22 people in a Baron's traveling party were an acceptable cost of keeping the ambush operational long enough to serve whatever purpose it still served. "How long ago did the advance guard arrive?" he said. 10 minutes, Harwick said. "I came straight here." "Where's Lucien now?" "Outer yard. He refused to wait in the courtyard. He's—" Harwick paused, which was rare. "He's asking for the Duchess, sir." The room went very quiet. Cassian did not turn around. He heard Serafina's breath shift, not sharpen, not catch, but change in the specific way breathing changes when a person is holding themselves very still on purpose. "Tell His Royal Highness," Cassian said, "that the Duke and Duchess of Blackmere will receive him in the Great Hall in 20 minutes. Harwick left. Cassian turned. She was standing where he'd left her, 2 feet away, and her face was doing the thing he was now familiar enough with to read. The layers of it, the composed surface, and underneath it something that was neither afraid nor eager, but was paying very close, very careful attention to what he would do next. "He asked for you by name," Cassian said. "I heard. He arrived 4 days early on the wrong road." "I heard that too." He looked at her. "I need you to walk into that great hall beside me, and I need the people watching to see exactly what they're looking at." Her chin came up slightly. "What are they looking at?" "Blackmere," he said. "Not the Duke or the Duchess separately. Blackmere." A beat. Something moved through her expression. Not quite surprise, not quite the guarded reassessment he'd been seeing for 10 days. Something that was making a decision about whether to be believed. "Then we shouldn't keep him waiting," she said. Crown Prince Lucien Aldrath was taller than Cassian remembered. That was the first thing. The second was that he was wearing riding clothes that were deliberately plain. No crown insignia, no formal markers of rank beyond the quality of the fabric. And that the choice was calculated in the specific way that charming men calculate their presentations, the strategic deployment of informality to create the impression of authenticity. He was 29, and he was not stupid, and he had been told stories about a woman, and the moment Cassian and Serafina came through the great hall doors together, Lucien looked at her. Not at Cassian, at her. Cassian noted this the way he noted everything, cleanly, without reaction, filed and assessed. "Your Grace." Lucien inclined his head to Cassian, then turned the full weight of his attention to Serafina. "Duchess Valicrest, I've heard a great deal about you." "Your Royal Highness," her voice was level. "You arrived ahead of schedule. The road conditions recommended it." A pause. "I hope the disruption is manageable." "Blackmere manages disruption well," she said. "We've had practice recently." Something moved through Lucien's eyes. Quick, appreciative. The look of a man who had expected to be charmed and was instead interested, which was more dangerous. "I understand you do," he said. "The provisioning fraud, the riots. I've been told the resolution was unconventional." "It was practical," she said. "People were hungry. The practical solution was to feed them." Lucian smiled. It was a good smile. Not the performed smile of a politician, but the real one that politicians learn to deploy as their most convincing tool. "I wish more of my father's advisors thought in those terms." Cassian stepped forward. Not aggressively. Nothing that could be read as aggression toward the Crown Prince without triggering a political incident. A step that simply placed him in the geometry of the conversation, close enough to Serafina that the physical alignment was unambiguous. "Your Highness will want to rest after the road," he said. "We'll convene formally at dinner. There are security matters I need to brief you on before then." A pause. "Privately." Lucian looked at him. The assessment in it was mutual, and not quite friendly, and not quite hostile. Two experienced men calibrating the distance between those things. "Of course," Lucian said. "I'd welcome that. Passam." The private briefing lasted 40 minutes. Cassian told him about Morn, the ambush, the death toll, the intelligence office's findings about the Imperial Guard connection. He told him about the two networks, the one that had arranged the ambush and the one that had redirected Lucian's route, and what the existence of both implied. Lucian listened without interrupting. He was better at listening than Cassian had expected, which revised his assessment of the man upward in one column and sideways in another. "Who redirected my route?" Lucian said when Cassian finished. "I don't know yet." "Your theory." "Someone with access to your private itinerary who wanted you alive and was willing to let Morn's people die to preserve the ambush's operational integrity." He paused. "That combination of motivations is not common." Lucien was quiet for a moment. "You're describing someone who cares more about my survival than about 22 civilians." "I'm describing someone who made a choice. What the choice means depends on who made it. And you have no candidates." Cassian looked at him steadily. "I have a short list of people with access to your travel documents. Your Highness is in a better position than I am to evaluate the names on it." Lucien stood up and went to the window. He stood there for a moment looking out at the castle yard with his hands behind his back, and Cassian studied his posture the way he studied everything, reading it, cataloging the tension across the shoulders, the specific quality of stillness that was not comfortable. "My secretary," Lucian said without turning. "Tomas Fell. He's been with me for 3 years." A pause. "He knew the original route. He suggested the change 4 days ago, citing a merchant report about road conditions on the northern pass." Another pause. "He didn't mention the report came from outside the normal intelligence channels." Cassian felt the coldness of it. "Where's Fell now?" "Somewhere in this castle." Lucian turned. "He rode with the advance guard." Mtaget. They found Tomas Fell in the east guest corridor. He was a slight man, 40 years old, with the particular colorlessness of people who have made a professional life of being unnoticed in the rooms of important men. He was walking toward the guest suite assigned to Lucien's party when Harwick's men stopped him, and the look on his face when Harwick appeared was not surprise. That was the thing. Not surprise. Cassian read that in 2 seconds and knew. They brought him to the East Guard room, and Cassian sat across from him at the bare table without preamble. "You knew about the ambush," Cassian said. Fell looked at him. His face was composed in the way that people compose their faces when they've rehearsed this moment. "I don't know what you did." "You redirected the Crown Prince's route 4 days ago, using a merchant report that didn't come from an approved intelligence source. You knew the northern pass was compromised." Cassian paused. "You didn't tell anyone." Silence. 22 people in Lord Morn's party are dead," Cassian said. "You had information that could have saved them. You used it to save one person." He let the silence work for a moment. "Tell me why." Fell's composed face held for approximately 4 more seconds. Then something in it cracked. Not dramatically, not the way people crack in stories, but in the small, specific way of someone who has been carrying a weight past the point their body can hold it. "I was told only to redirect His Highness," Fell said, I was told the pass information was reliable and that getting him off the northern road was the priority. I was not told... He stopped. You were not told about Morn. I was told the pass was dangerous. I didn't know the extent. You didn't ask. A long pause. No. Cassian looked at him. Who told you? The name that came out of Fell's mouth was one Cassian recognized immediately, and then spent approximately 3 seconds rejecting because it could not be right. Because if it was right, then the architecture of the last 10 years of his life had a different foundation than he thought. Lord Edric Morn, the man currently in Cassian's secure guest suite, protected, trusted, feeding Cassian information about the ambush network from the inside. Morn, who had walked into Blackmere 3 days ago with a crossbow bolt in his shoulder and 22 of his own people dead on a pass he had organized the travel through, carrying letters about a political coalition that now, in this new light, read not as the target of the ambush, but as its cover story. Cassian sat very still. Morn had not stumbled into Blackmere as a survivor. Morn had walked into Blackmere as an operative. The ambush had killed his own people, people he had recruited specifically to die convincingly, and delivered him inside Cassian's walls with a story that would justify his extended stay, his access, and the specific intelligence he had been feeding Cassian about the attack network. Every piece of information Morn had provided over 3 days had been shaping Cassian's investigation, directing it toward the Imperial Palace connection, toward the anonymous network, away from the man sitting in the secure guest suite eating Blackmere's food. Cassian thought about the letters, the Eastern Coalition, the Succession Review. How convenient that Morn had arrived carrying documentation of a political conspiracy that would explain why he was targeted and that would give Cassian something large and structural to investigate while Morn sat inside his walls and waited. Waited for what? Lucian's arrival. Cassian stood up. He looked at Harwick in the doorway. Locke fell down. Don't let him communicate with anyone. He was already moving. Morn's suite, now. The secure guest suite was on the second floor of the north wing, which was the most defensible residential section of the castle. Cassian's own decision, made 3 days ago, to ensure Morn's safety. He had put the man he was trying to protect in the location that was hardest to reach quickly from the main hall. He took the north stair at a run. Harwick was beside him and 2 guards behind them, and Cassian was already knowing, with the specific certainty of a mind that processes threat faster than emotion, that the suite would be empty, that Morn had seen Lucian arrive, that Morn had understood his window. The suite door was unlocked. Inside, the rumpled bed, the half-eaten dinner tray from last night, the traveling bag open on the chair with clothing still inside. Morn had left in a hurry, but not in a panic. The bag left deliberately, the window shutters open, the door unlocked. Not the exit of a man fleeing, the exit of a man who had finished what he came to do and was now somewhere inside Cassian's castle, 4 days early, crown prince and all, moving toward a target. Find him, Cassian said. Every corridor, every room. Do not fire unless he fires. I want him alive. A beat. And get the Duchess inside the keep. Now! Harwick was already talking into the corridor. The guards split. Cassian stood in the empty room and looked at the open window and felt, for the first time in 16 years of ruling this duchy, the specific nauseating weight of having been played. Not outmaneuvered in a negotiation or outflanked in a border dispute. Played. Morn had walked into his castle with a wound and a story, and Cassian had applied every protocol correctly, and it had not been enough because the threat was already inside when he locked the gates. 11 years he had trusted Aldrich Vane. 3 days he had trusted Edric Morn. The gap in those numbers did not make the second failure smaller. If anything, it made it larger. Because in 3 days, with a bolt wound and a dead party and a compelling story, a man had gotten further inside Cassian's defenses than 11 years of proximity had given Vane. What Vane had taken was money. What Morn was after was in this castle right now, and Cassian did not yet know if it was Lucian, Morn's own documents, or something else entirely. He went back into the corridor at a run. What? He found her first. Not Morn, not Lucian. Serafina, coming fast around the corner of the east corridor, with her maid Bretta behind her and a look on her face that was not panic. Serafina, he was learning, did not panic, she accelerated. And she was already talking when she saw him. Morn was in the castle records room, she said without preamble. Bretta saw him 20 minutes ago. I didn't know to flag it until Harwick's guard just came to the suite. She held out her small leather book, open to a page. He asked Oren for access to the estate documents 3 days ago. I didn't know until this morning when Oren mentioned it in passing. Cassian took the book, read the page. She had been noting discrepancies. Quiet, methodical, the same instinct that had built the fraud case. She had been watching Morn the way she watched everything, not from suspicion, but from the baseline habit of a woman who kept copies of everything because she had learned not to trust that the picture she was given was the complete one. He accessed the northern road deeds, she said, the land grants on either side of the upper pass, the ones that were reissued after the flood damage in the spring. Cassian went still. The northern pass land grants, reissued in the spring, which meant they carried the current legal boundaries after the flood reconfiguration, boundaries that determined which territories fell under Blackmere's direct jurisdiction and which fell under the eastern baronies, boundaries that were currently in a legal gray area because the reissuance had not yet been formally registered with the Imperial Land Office. If those documents disappeared, Blackmere's claim to the Upper Pass jurisdiction disappeared with them. And without that jurisdiction, the Empire's case for maintaining Blackmere's current trade authority, the specific legal basis on which Cassian's control of the northern routes rested, developed a hole large enough to push a succession review through. He's not here for Lucien, Cassian said. No, Serafina said. He's here for the land grants. She had figured it out before he had. That registered briefly in the part of his mind that was not currently running threat calculations. Where's Lucien? He said. His Highness went to the library 20 minutes ago. He asked for maps of the northern territories. Of course he did. Cassian turned to the two guards behind him. One of you, the library, stay with the Crown Prince until I say otherwise. One of you, the records room. He went for the records room himself, accepted. Morn was still inside. That was the first surprise. The second was that he was not attempting to leave. He was standing at the central document table with 3 of the land grant scrolls spread open and a copying instrument in his hand, and when Cassian came through the door, he looked up without flinching. Duke Valacrest, he said. The composure of it was remarkable. Cassian had the brief, cold recognition of a man looking at a mirror image of himself, someone who had decided before the moment arrived exactly how they would hold themselves inside it. Put the instrument down, Cassian said. Morn set it down. Your copies, Cassian said. Morn reached into his coat and produced 3 folded sheets, set them on the table beside the originals. The gesture was precise, deliberate, not the gesture of a man surrendering but of a man completing a transaction. You were never going to run, Cassian said. Running was never the plan, Morn said. The plan was documentation. The copies go to 3 separate parties simultaneously. Destroying them here changes nothing. They're already in transit from 2 other sources. He looked at Cassian. This was never about theft. It was about establishing a record. A record of what? That the Northern Pass land grants were executed under irregular authority. That the Duke of Blackmere has been administering territory outside his legitimate jurisdiction for 14 months. Morn paused. There are people in the capital who've been waiting for documentation of exactly that irregularity. Cassian looked at him. The coldness was not anger. Anger was hot, and he had burned through the capacity for it in the corridor upstairs. What he felt now was colder than that. The specific temperature of a man standing in a room looking at the actual shape of the threat he'd misread for 3 days, understanding not just the immediate tactical situation, but the full architecture of what had been built around him while he investigated a ghost. The irregularity in the land grant issuance, Cassian said, was created 6 months ago, deliberately. By whom? Morn looked at him for a moment. You're asking me to tell you who built the trap you're standing in. I'm asking you to tell me if there's a way out of it that doesn't require 22 more deaths. A pause. Something moved through Morn's expression, something that was not remorse exactly, but was adjacent to it. The look of a man who has made choices he has reasoned himself into accepting and is now being asked to look at the reasoning directly. The land grant irregularity was introduced by someone inside your own administration, Morn said, before Vane was arrested. He paused. Vane wasn't running the fraud network. He was helping dismantle it, selectively, to redirect suspicion while the real structure was built into the legal foundation of the duchy itself. The silence in the records room was absolute. Vane had not been protecting the fraud. Vane had been managing it, guiding Cassian's attention toward the surface corruption, Fordham, Cray, Pell. While underneath, someone had been laying groundwork in the land records, the legal instruments, the foundational documents of everything Cassian had built. Someone Cassian had never suspected because he had been looking at Vane. Someone who had been inside the castle long enough to access the land records, understand the legal architecture, and introduce a flaw so precisely positioned that it would survive routine inspection and only become visible when someone was specifically looking for it. The ink-stained hand, the evidence volumes, the note in the back cover of the third volume that said, "I keep looking at these numbers and thinking that someone who built Blackmere's trade recovery from nothing cannot possibly have missed it unless he stopped looking." She had been looking at the numbers for a year. "The person who built the irregularity into the land grants," Cassian said, very carefully. "Where are they now?" Morn looked at him with an expression that was, for the first time since Cassian had found him in the records room, something close to genuine. "Your Grace," Morn said, "they're the reason I'm standing in this room instead of already gone. I needed to know if you'd figured it out." "Figured what out?" "That the case your Duchess built against Vane, the evidence, the receipts, the fraud network, it was real. Every piece of it was real." Morn paused. "It was also exactly the evidence needed to guarantee Vane's arrest and removal, which cleared the one person in this castle who might have caught the land grant irregularity before it became legally actionable." He held Cassian's gaze. "Someone needed Vane gone. Someone who understood your household well enough to know that the Duchess was building that case and that once it was complete, you would act on it." The room tilted. Not physically. The stone floor was exactly where it had been, and the torches were still burning, and the land grant scrolls were still on the table. But something in Cassian's understanding of the last 3 weeks shifted, the entire structure of it, the fraud case, and the arrests, and the morning she had stood in the East Corridor and handed him the third volume, reshuffled itself around a new central possibility that he did not want to look at directly. She had built the case against Vane. She had done it alone, over a year, with meticulous care. And someone had used it, or someone had built it to be used. "I need you to say it plainly," Cassian said. Morn looked at him. "Your Duchess's evidence was either assembled by a very intelligent woman who was being used without her knowledge," he said, "or assembled by a very intelligent woman who knew exactly what removing Vane would make possible." He paused. "I don't know which. That's the question I needed you in this room to answer, because if it's the second—" He stopped. "If it's the second, and the Crown Prince is currently in your library asking for maps of the Northern Territories, then Blackmere is not just under legal attack, it's under occupation. And the person who opened the gates is the one person in this castle you've just decided to trust." Cassian stood in the records room for 3 seconds that were the longest 3 seconds of 16 years. Then he walked out, fast. No instructions to Morn, no guards, no protocol. The protocol could wait. Everything could wait. The East Corridor, the sitting room, the door he had knocked on 3 times in 8 days. He went to it and knocked once and didn't wait for an answer. She was inside, standing at the desk. And when she looked up and saw his face, something in her expression did something he had never seen it do in 6 years. She braced, not guiltily, not like someone caught, like someone who had been waiting for this specific moment and had known it was coming and had been deciding for some time how they would stand inside it. "Tell me," he said, "who else knew about the land grant irregularity?" She looked at him steadily and said nothing. She said nothing. Not the nothing of guilt. Not the nothing of a woman caught in a lie and calculating her next move. She stood behind her desk in the warm room with the maps on the wall and looked at him with the steadiness he had come to know. That particular quality of stillness that was not passivity, but something harder, something that had been built over years of being in rooms where speaking first was dangerous. Cassian stepped inside and closed the door. Serafina. I heard the question, she said. Then answer it. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she said, Sit down. He did not sit down. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at her and felt the specific cold patience of a man who has run out of the kind of patience that flinches. The land grant irregularity, she said, was introduced by Aldrich Vane's predecessor, a man named Caro who served your father and retired 7 years ago to the eastern provinces. She paused. I found it in February, the same month I started building the fraud case. The fire cracked. Cassian did not move. I found it, she said, because I was looking at the foundational documents for the Northern Pass Trade Authority, trying to understand how the provisioning network was structured legally, and I found a discrepancy in the land grant reissuance that traced back to a clerical modification made 8 years ago. She looked at him directly. It was not accidental. It was deliberate. And it had been sitting in your legal foundation for 8 years, invisible, waiting for someone to point at it. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know yet who put it there or who knew about it, she said. And because if I came to you with a legal irregularity in the foundational documents of the Northern Territory without understanding how it got there or who could use it, I was handing you a problem I couldn't help you solve. A pause. I needed to understand the full shape of it first. You've had 8 months. Yes. And in 8 months you didn't once think to... He stopped, breathed, started again. Morn says someone used your fraud case to remove Vane, deliberately, to clear the one person who might have found the land grant problem before it became actionable. Her face did something complicated. Morn told you that? Yes. Morn, she said carefully, is a man who came into this castle with a story designed to make him credible and then spent 3 days directing your investigation away from himself. Everything he told you served his purpose. She paused. Including that. Cassian looked at her. Think about what he needed, she said. He needed the land grant copies. He needed time inside your walls to make them. And he needed you uncertain enough about me that you would not be thinking clearly about him. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Not fear, something older and rawer than fear. The sound of a person saying a true thing and not knowing if it will be believed. I did not build that case to remove Vane. I built it because 20 families in the outer villages were starving because of what Vane's network was doing and because it was the right thing to do. And yes, I knew about the land grant irregularity. I was still working on who put it there. She held his gaze. I was going to tell you. When? When I knew enough to also tell you how to fix it. The silence between them had weight and temperature. Outside, somewhere in the castle, he could hear boots on stone, Harwick's people moving, the systematic search still running, and the distant, ordinary sounds of a fortress going about its evening while something irreversible was happening in a small, warm room with maps on the walls. Cassian looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at the evidence volumes in his study, methodically, without the buffer of prior assumption, reading what was actually there instead of what he'd expected. What was there was a woman who had been right about everything for 8 months and had been carrying it alone. What was there was ink on her right hand and maps she'd marked herself, and a year of work done in the margins of a life that had not given her much room to work in. She was either the most loyal person in this castle or the most dangerous one. The problem was that both required the same qualities, and he was looking at those qualities and could not, with the certainty he required, determine which they were in service of. He had 16 years of experience reading people. He had 16 years of knowing when someone was lying. He did not know if she was lying. That was new. That was something he had not experienced before. And it sat in him like a blade point pressing without yet cutting. And the discomfort of it was not the discomfort of suspicion. It was the discomfort of someone who has built their entire identity on the ability to read rooms and has just found a room they cannot read. All right, he said. She blinked. Just slightly. All right? I'm not going to resolve this standing here. He turned toward the door. Stay in this room. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone except me or Harwick. Cassian, I have a crown prince in my library and a fugitive in my castle and copies of my land grants in transit to people I haven't identified yet. He stopped with his hand on the door. I need 2 hours. After that, you and I finish this conversation. All of it." He paused. "I mean that." He went out. He said. The alarm bell started ringing at the top of the hour. Not the watchtower signal this time. The main keep bell, which meant a breach inside the walls, which meant something had gone wrong at a level that had gotten past Harwick's search pattern, and Cassian was already running before the second sequence finished. He found Harwick at the base of the north stair, with blood on his left sleeve and 3 guards behind him, and an expression that Cassian had seen exactly twice before. "The library," Harwick said. 3 of Morn's men. They were inside the castle before we locked it down. We missed them in the initial sweep. They were in the cellars." "Lucien. His Highness is alive. 2 of his personal guard are not." Harwick's jaw was tight. "They're holding the library. Morn is with them. He got out of the records room while we were running the search." A pause. "Sir, they have the Duchess." The cold that moved through Cassian's chest was not fear. He had trained himself over 20 years to convert fear into function, to take the thing that wanted to be panic and compress it into something operational. He did it now. He breathed through it, felt it compress, and on the other side of the compression was a specific absolute clarity. He had left her in the sitting room. She had barred the door. Someone had gotten through a barred door, which meant either she had opened it or someone had come through the wall. The sitting room had a connecting corridor to the library's rear access. He had known this abstractly, the way you know things about rooms you don't use. Morn had been in the castle records room, which was adjacent to that same corridor, and he had had 3 days to memorize the floor plan. Cassian looked at Harwick. "How many in the library total?" 4. Morn, 3 armed men, plus Lucien and the Duchess. A pause. "And Morn has the original land grant documents. He got to the records room a second time during the sweep." "What does he want?" "He hasn't said yet. He sent one of his men to the corridor with a message. He wants to speak to you. Alone." Cassian started walking toward the library. "Sir," Harwick said following, "protocol says—" "I know what protocol says. You can't go in there alone with 4 armed men." "I know that too." He stopped at the library door. Heavy oak, iron-banded, currently barred from the inside. He could hear nothing through it. He looked at the door for a moment and thought about what was on the other side of it, and what he was about to do, and whether it was tactically sound. It was not tactically sound. He knocked. A beat. Then the bar scraped back and the door opened 6 inches, and one of Morn's men looked at him through the gap with the specific wariness of someone who has been told the person outside is dangerous. "Just me," Cassian said. "Tell Morn." The door opened. The library was Blackmere's largest interior room. 60 feet long, 2 stories of shelving, a gallery running the upper level with iron railings. The lamps were lit and threw long shadows across the reading tables and the floor between them. Lucien was sitting in a chair near the central table with his hands visible and his face composed in the particular way that men compose their faces when they are in physical danger and have decided that composure is the appropriate response. He was not injured. He was watching Cassian with an expression that was, despite everything, still assessing. Morn stood near the far wall with the land grant documents under one arm and the other hand resting near, not on, the weapon at his belt. His 3 men were positioned at points around the room with the practiced geometry of people who had done this before. Serafina was standing beside the bookshelf along the east wall. Not restrained, not visibly threatened. Standing with her arms at her sides and her face doing the layered thing he could read now, the composed surface and underneath it something that was paying very close attention to angles and distances and exits. She was not looking at Morn. She was looking at Cassian. He looked back at her for exactly 1 second, then he looked at Morn. "You have what you came for," Cassian said. "The copies are in transit. The originals are under your arm. There's nothing left in this castle that advances your position." He stopped 10 feet from Morn. "So tell me what you actually want." Morn looked at him. "I want you to understand what's happening to your duchy." "I understand it." "You understand the land grants. You don't understand the rest." Morn's voice was not triumphant. It was the voice of a man who believed what he was saying, which was more dangerous than theater. The irregularity in the land grants is the documentation. The actual mechanism is the succession review. There are 6 Eastern barons and 3 imperial advisors who have been building a legal case for 18 months for the redistribution of Northern Trade Authority following a formal review of Blackmere's jurisdictional legitimacy. He paused. When those documents reach the capital, the review is triggered automatically. The Crown cannot refuse it. Another pause. I'm not here to destroy Blackmere, Valicrest. I'm here because Blackmere's current structure is being used to strangle Eastern trade, and the people it's strangling have been trying to address that through official channels for 4 years and getting nowhere. Because I have the legal authority. Because you have legal authority that was structured by your father 20 years ago to serve your father's interests, and it has not been revisited since, and the Empire has changed around it. Morn looked at him steadily. The review will happen. The question is whether it happens with Blackmere at the table or over Blackmere's body. Cassian looked at him for a long moment. You could have made this argument, Cassian said, without 22 dead people on a mountain pass. Something moved through Morn's face. The ambush was not mine. Then whose? The people who don't want a negotiated review, who want the irregularity to trigger a forced redistribution before Blackmere has time to respond. Morn paused. The people I was trying to get documentation to before they could reach it first. He shifted the documents under his arm. I came to your castle with a story because walking in as a known operative of the Eastern Coalition would have gotten me detained before I could complete the copy. The ambush on my party was real. My people who died were real. His voice tightened briefly on those 2 words. I arranged the travel knowing the pass was compromised because I needed the wound and the story to get inside your walls. I did not arrange the ambush. I survived it. There is a difference. The room was very quiet. Cassian thought about the architecture of it, the 2 networks, the protection of Lucien, the deliberate targeting of Morn's party. He thought about who benefited from Morn dead on the pass versus Morn inside Blackmere walls. He thought about the land grant irregularities sitting in his duchy's legal foundation for 8 years, and the specific timing of when someone had decided to use it. He thought about Serafina, standing at the east wall, who had found the irregularity in February and had been building toward this conversation for 8 months. He turned and looked at her. You knew, he said, not an accusation, a question. I knew there was a review being prepared, she said. I didn't know the mechanism until I found the land grant problem, and I didn't know Morn specifically. She paused. I knew someone was going to use the irregularity to force a review. I've been trying to understand who and why so there would be something to negotiate with. A beat. That's why I was still working on it. You were building a counterposition. I was building the information needed to have a real conversation instead of a forced one. She held his gaze, which is what Morn is trying to have right now. Cassian looked at Morn, then at the documents under his arm, then at Lucien, sitting in the chair near the table, who had been silent and watching with the specific attention of a man who was not just surviving this situation but studying it. Lucien spoke for the first time. The review can be structured, he said quietly. If Blackmere requests it formally, before the documents trigger it, a requested review carries different legal weight than a forced one. The terms are negotiable. He paused. My father will not live another 5 years. When I ascend, I need the Northern Territories stable, and I need their trade authority legitimized, not contested. He looked at Cassian. I didn't come here 4 days early because of road conditions. The room absorbed that. You came, Cassian said slowly, because someone told you the review was about to be triggered. I came because the person who redirected my route also sent me a letter 3 weeks ago telling me that Blackmere's Duchess had found the land grant problem and was building toward a resolution and that I should be present for the conversation. Lucien paused. The letter was unsigned. The analysis inside it was the most precise reading of the northern trade situation I have encountered in 4 years of studying it. Cassian turned and looked at Serafina. She was looking at the floor, just for a moment. Then she looked up and met his eyes, and the expression on her face was the most unguarded he had ever seen it. Not the composed surface, not the managed layers. Just her, in the light, with the specific tiredness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has arrived at the moment of setting it down. You wrote to him, Cassian said. I wrote to him, she said, 3 weeks ago, before the riots, before Morn. I wrote to him because I had found the problem, and I had not yet found a way to bring it to you that you would hear, and I needed the review to happen on terms that preserved Blackmere instead of dismantling it, and that required someone at the crown level to understand the situation before it became a crisis. The silence. You went over my head, he said. I went around the obstacle, she said, which was not the Empire. It was not Morn, or the Eastern Coalition, or the land grant irregularity. She held his gaze. The obstacle was a duke who had stopped looking at his own duchy and didn't have enough information to see what was happening to it. It landed with the specific weight of a true thing said without cruelty. Not wielded, simply said. The way she said everything, level, precise, with the bare minimum of ornamentation. It landed in the center of him and stayed there. Give him the documents, Cassian said to Morn, without looking away from her. Morn paused. Your Grace. Give the Crown Prince the documents. The originals. Cassian finally turned. If the review is coming regardless, it comes from Blackmere's hand, on Blackmere's terms, with the Duke and Duchess of Blackmere present at the table. He looked at Lucien. That's what you came here for. Lucien looked at him for a moment. Then he stood. Yes, he said. It is. Morn looked at the documents in his hands, then at Cassian. Then, slowly, he crossed the room and set them on the table in front of Lucien. The three armed men looked at each other, the specific, uncertain pause of people who have been prepared for a confrontation and are recalibrating around its absence. Harwick's people were still outside the door. The bar was off. The math of the room had changed. Tell your men to stand down, Cassian said to Morn. And then you and I are going to sit at that table, and you're going to tell me every name in the Eastern Coalition. And Lucien is going to tell me what a requested review looks like. And we are going to spend the next 4 hours building the thing that keeps this duchy from being carved up by people who are not in this room. He paused. Do you have any objections to that? Morn looked at him for a long moment. No, he said. I don't. Cassian nodded. Then he crossed the room to where Serafina was standing at the east wall and stopped in front of her, close, the same distance as the sitting room 3 nights ago when the bells had interrupted everything. She looked up at him. We're finishing that conversation afterward, he said quietly. All of it. Tonight. Something moved through her face, that same brief, unguarded quality, the 2 seconds before she collected it. Except this time she didn't collect it entirely. She let it stay. All right, she said. Her third time saying those 2 words in 8 days, each time meaning something different. This one meaning something he did not yet have the language for but was going to learn. He turned back to the room, and that was when the main keep bell started ringing again. Not the breach pattern this time, not the watchtower signal, but the sequence that had not been used in 11 years. 3 long, 2 short. 3 long. The assault pattern. Harwick's voice came through the door, hard and urgent. Your Grace, the northern and eastern roads both. Armed columns, organized, moving fast. We count at least 300. A beat. They're flying no colors. 300 organized soldiers on both roads simultaneously. Not a border skirmish, not a riot. A coordinated military assault on a timetable that had been running in parallel to everything that had just happened inside these walls. The Morn operation, the library standoff, the documents, all of it had been a distraction, and while Cassian had been managing the distraction, the real force had been moving into position. Someone had planned for the review to fail. Someone had planned for the conversation not to happen. Someone had sent 300 soldiers to make sure that whatever was negotiated in this library tonight would be irrelevant by morning. Cassian looked at the room. Morn's face. Lucien's face. Serafina's face. None of them had known, which meant there was a third network. And it was already at his gates. He had 300 soldiers on 2 roads, a crown prince in his library, a duchess who had been running a parallel operation for 8 months, and a castle that had been at half-security alert for 4 days while the real threat was assembling in the dark. He had been here before. Not this specific configuration, but the essential shape of it, outnumbered, outmaneuvered on the surface, standing inside walls that were built to hold, and deciding whether the walls were enough or whether the outcome required something the walls alone couldn't provide. Every time he had faced this shape before, he had survived it by being harder and colder and more ruthless than the people on the other side of the gates, by making himself into the thing that the stories said he was. He looked at Serafina. She was already looking at him. And in her eyes, not fear, not the managed composure, but something clear and present and absolutely steady. He saw the thing he had been missing for 16 years. Not a strategist, not a political asset, not the quiet wife who filed reports that got buried. A partner, standing in a library with 300 soldiers at the gates, already thinking 3 moves ahead. He turned to Harwick's voice through the door. "How long before they reach the walls?" 20 minutes, maybe less on the Eastern Road. 20 minutes. 300 soldiers. A crown prince who could not be allowed to die in this castle. A duchess who had just told the crown prince the truth about his duchy before Cassian had gotten to it himself, and who had been, in that act, more loyal to Blackmere than anyone he had ever paid. He pulled the door open. Harwick was in the corridor with 8 guards and the face of a man waiting for orders that would define the next 12 hours. "Pull everyone off the interior search," Cassian said. "Full defensive posture, north and east walls. I want archers on every embrasure and the inner gate held until I give the order personally." He paused. "And get me my armor." Harwick moved. Cassian turned back into the library. He looked at Lucien. "Your Highness needs to be in the keep's inner chamber, now. 2 of your personal guard and 4 of mine." Lucien stood. You can survive this," Cassian said, "or you can be useful later. Choose." He held the prince's gaze for exactly 1 second. "There is no third option tonight." Lucien looked at him, then nodded once, and moved toward the door with his guard. Cassian turned to Serafina last. She was already at the table, the land grant documents and Morn's copies spread open in front of her, the small leather book open beside them, her pen moving. She was making a list, names, provisions, something he would need to look at later. She was doing the work, right now, in the middle of everything. "You need to go to the keep," he said. She looked up. "The inner garrison's food stores were last inventoried 6 weeks ago. If this runs past 48 hours, they need to know what they have." She looked at him. "I'll go to the keep. But I'm going through the provisioning corridor, and I'm stopping in the steward's office first." He looked at her for a moment. 5 minutes, he said. "Then you're in the keep, and the door is barred, and you don't come out until I come for you." "Agreed." She closed the leather book and stood. She walked toward him, toward the door, and stopped close, very close, the closest they had stood since the east corridor by torchlight, what felt like a lifetime ago. She looked up at him. There was something in her face that was not strategy and not composure, and not the managed distance of 6 years, something raw and present and close enough to touch. "Come back," she said. Simply. Not a request. Not an order. A statement of what she needed that she was saying out loud instead of keeping in the back of a notebook for someone else to find. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She walked out. He strapped on the sword Harwick brought him, the one he had not worn in 4 years because Blackmere had been at peace, and he felt the weight of it settle against his hip the way old things settle when they return to their purpose, and he walked toward the north wall where 300 soldiers were 15 minutes away from finding out what the Iron Duke was willing to lose and what he was not. The answer, he now knew, with the specific, irreversible clarity of a man who has just found the thing he did not know he was missing, was nothing. He was not willing to lose anything in this castle tonight. Not the walls, not the duchy, not the crown prince sheltering in the keep, and not the woman in the provisioning corridor with ink on her hand and a leather book and 8 months of work she had done in the dark for a man who had not been looking. He went up the north wall stairs as the first torches appeared on the road below, and the cold night air hit him full in the face, and somewhere behind him the main keep bell was still ringing its 3 long, 2 short, 3 long pattern into the dark, and Cassian Valicrest, Duke of Blackmere, looked out at the organized columns moving toward his walls and felt, beneath the tactical clarity and the weight of the sword and the 16 years of knowing how to make himself into something that did not break, a single, clean emotion. Not fear, not anger, fury, the clean kind, the kind that does not cloud the thinking, the kind that comes from standing on the edge of losing something that matters and deciding that losing is not a variable. "Harwick," he said. "Sir?" "When they reach the wall, I want them to understand something before the first arrow flies." He looked out at the torches. "They are not attacking a fortress tonight." He paused. "They are attacking a mistake." Below, the columns kept coming. The first wave hit the northern wall at the 20th minute, exactly as Cassian had calculated. They came with ladders and organized discipline. Not a mob, not desperate villagers with farm tools, but soldiers who had drilled for this specific configuration, who knew how to move under arrow fire and absorb the first casualties without breaking formation. Whoever had sent them had sent professionals. That told Cassian something useful. This was expensive. This was not a political maneuver or a legal gambit that had turned violent. This was a funded operation, planned in advance, with a budget and a commander who understood siege mechanics. He stood on the north wall walk with Harwick at his left, and a sword in his hand for the first time in 4 years, and he thought, with the cold clarity that combat always gave him, about money, about who had the resources to field 300 professional soldiers, and the motivation to deploy them against Blackmere on the same night a crown prince happened to be inside its walls. The Eastern Coalition wanted a negotiated review. Morn had been clear about that, and Cassian, reading the man through the library confrontation, believed it. Morn wanted documents and a seat at the table. He did not want a battle, which meant the people at his walls were the third network, the ones who did not want a negotiated review, the ones who needed the legal irregularity to trigger a forced redistribution before Blackmere could respond, the ones who had arranged the ambush on the northern pass and let Morn's party die to keep the operation intact, the ones who had planned for this conversation to never happen. Cassian raised his sword, and the first volley of arrows went out from the embrasures, and the night erupted into the specific controlled chaos of a wall defense that Blackmere had been built for 300 years ago and had maintained in the specific way that men maintain things they hope never to use again, meticulously, without faith in the hope. He fought the way he had always fought, without hesitation, without the internal noise of doubt or calculation, the decisions happening in the body before the mind finished framing them. A man came over the parapet on a grapple, and Cassian was already moving, the engagement lasting 4 seconds, the man going back over the wall. Another. 3 more minutes of concentrated pressure on the northeast corner that Harwick's voice cut through from 20 feet away, redirecting 2 guards, the gap closing. But underneath the fighting, underneath the noise and the physical immediacy of it, something was running in him that had not run in the previous 16 years of ruling this duchy. Not tactics, not the cold management of threat and response. Something that had a specific location in his chest and was connected, with a directness he could not sever, to a woman in the keep's inner chamber with a leather book and ink-stained hands who had said, "Come back," like it was the simplest and most essential sentence in the language. He had fought before for Blackmere, for the duchy, for the routes, for the legal and economic structures that 17 years of his life had built. He had fought with the conviction of ownership and the discipline of a man who does not permit himself to lose what he has decided to keep. This was different. The thing he was fighting for tonight was not a structure. It was not a trade route or land grant or a jurisdictional boundary. It was something that did not have a value in the ledgers and could not be measured in the accounting methodology he had spent his life mastering, and it was more real than any of those things had ever been. And the difference between tonight and every other fight of his life was the difference between defending walls and defending something that lived inside them. Men fight hardest for what they almost lost before they understood they had it. He had not understood it for 6 years. He understood it now. And the understanding had the quality of a door opening, not metaphorical, not gradual, but the specific, physical, irreversible opening of something that cannot be closed again. He drove 3 men back from the parapet with the sustained aggression of someone for whom retreat is simply not a category, and heard Harwick call the eastern wall clear, and kept moving. The assault broke at the 3rd hour. Not because Blackmere's walls failed, they did not fail. Not because Cassian's men ran out of will or arrows or the specific bone-deep stubbornness that long-defended fortresses develop in their people over generations. The assault broke because of Lucien. At the 2nd hour, Against every instruction Cassian had given him, the crown prince of the empire appeared on the north wall walk in full regalia, the crown insignia visible, the imperial colors unmistakable in the torchlight, and stood at the embrasure and looked down at the soldiers below and said nothing. He simply stood there, visible, alive, present. The effect was immediate and not small. 300 professional soldiers had been sent to accomplish an objective. Part of that objective, Cassian now understood, had been to create a situation in which the crown prince could be reported dead or captured inside a rebellious northern duchy, a justification for the forced redistribution, a crisis that would require the empire to intervene and restructure the northern territories to restore order. The plan required Lucien's situation to be unknown, his safety unconfirmed, the narrative open. Lucien, standing on the wall in the torchlight, closed the narrative. The assault did not stop immediately. Professionals do not stop immediately. But the pressure reduced, and then reduced further. And by the time the third hour had passed and the eastern sky was beginning to lighten from black to the specific gray that precedes dawn, the columns were pulling back from both roads with the organized withdrawal of people who had reassessed the cost of continuing against the probability of success. Cassian watched them go from the north wall. He was bleeding from a cut along his left forearm. Not serious, the edge of something that had gotten through while he was moving, and his body had the specific comprehensive exhaustion of 3 hours of sustained combat, the kind that lives in the joints and the back of the eyes and does not fully announce itself until the immediate threat is gone and the body decides it's safe to make a full report. Harwick appeared at his shoulder. "They're clear of the second marker, sir. Both roads." "Who were they?" "Working on it. The ones we took prisoner are talking." A pause. "Early indication is they're contracted. Paid soldiers, not a noble house's standing force. The money goes east. We're following it." "Follow it all the way." Cassian looked at the empty road. "I want names." "Yes, sir." He looked at Lucien, standing 10 feet away on the wall walk, who had gone from inadvisable to decisive in the span of a choice made without asking permission. The regalia had been deliberate. The timing had been deliberate. The crown prince had looked at the tactical situation from inside the keep and made a calculation about what would stop the assault faster than anything Cassian's soldiers could do, and had been correct. Cassian looked at him. Lucien looked back. "You told me to survive or be useful," he said. "I chose." "You chose without telling me." "You were busy." A pause. "It worked." Cassian held his gaze for a moment. Then, against the pull of 16 years of not doing it, he said, "Yes, it did." He paused. "Thank you." Something moved through Lucien's expression. Surprise, quickly managed. He nodded once. They stood on the wall together in the gray pre-dawn light, and the specific silence between them was not the silence of two men calculating their relative positions. It was something quieter than that. Two men who had spent a night in the same castle, learning something about what the other one was, and finding the assessment revised. He went to the keep at dawn. The inner chamber door was barred from inside, exactly as he had instructed, and he knocked twice and said his name, and the bar scraped back and the door opened, and she was there. She was still dressed, had not slept, from the look of it, the shadows under her eyes that were not just the product of one night. The leather book was on the table behind her with pages covered in close writing. She had used the hours. She looked at him, at the cut on his arm, at his face. She stepped back and let him in, and he came inside and she closed the door, and they stood in the keep's inner chamber in the early morning light, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she crossed to the table and picked up a strip of clean cloth she had apparently prepared, or found, or torn from something, the specific improvisational readiness of a woman who had spent years making do, and came back to him and held out her hand. He gave her his arm. She cleaned the cut with the focused, practical attention she gave everything, her head bent over it, her fingers careful without being tentative. He watched the top of her head and felt the specific, overwhelming quality of being tended to by someone who chose to do it. Not paid to do it, not obligated by a contract. Choosing, in the gray morning after a night of assault bells and 3 hours of fighting, to clean the cut on his arm because she was the person in this room, and it needed doing. It was such a small thing. He had received field medicine from soldiers who were following procedure. He had received attention from physicians who were fulfilling professional obligation. He had never, in 41 years, had someone clean a wound on him because they simply wanted to. He had not known, until this moment, that the difference between those things was as large as it was. "It's not deep," she said without looking up. "No? You should have it looked at properly." "Later." She tied off the cloth and stepped back and looked up at him. And what was in her face was the unguarded version again. The one she'd stopped fully collecting since the library. The one that was simply her, in the available light, without the architecture of 6 years of managed distance. "Tell me what happened," she said. He told her. All of it. The wall, the 3 hours, Lucian on the parapet, the withdrawal, the contracted soldiers and the money going east and the names that Harwick's men were following. He told her in the flat, factual register he used for reports, and she listened in the way she listened to everything, not waiting for him to finish, but actually present for each piece, tracking, the eyes moving slightly as she connected things. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The money going east," she said. "It won't go to the barons in the coalition." "No, they didn't send those soldiers." "It'll go to the trade houses," she said, "the private ones with the imperial court connections, the ones who benefit from the current structure being dismantled quickly and chaotically rather than reviewed and renegotiated." She looked at him. "They've been building toward this for longer than Morn's coalition has. They wanted the forced redistribution because a chaotic redistribution creates gaps in the trade authority that private houses can step into before any legitimate successor framework is established." She paused. "A negotiated review closes those gaps before they open." He looked at her. "You knew about the trade houses," he said. "I suspected. I've been documenting it for 4 months. She went to the table and picked up the leather book and held it out. "It's all in here. It's not complete, but it's enough to begin." He took the book, opened it. The pages were dense and cross-referenced in the way her pages always were. Dates, names, transaction records, the same methodical architecture that had built the fraud case. He read the first 3 pages and understood the shape of it. She had been running a second investigation alongside the first one. The fraud case had been the surface. This had been underneath it. The deeper structure, the private trade house network that had been positioning around Blackmere's legal vulnerability for years, waiting for the right moment to push. She had been building both simultaneously for months, alone, without telling him. Not because she was working against him, but because she had not yet been certain enough of his attention to trust him with the incomplete version. He closed the book. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. She looked at him steadily. "What do you owe me?" "The truth. All of it." He looked at her directly. "I built this duchy from a position of deliberate isolation, and I convinced myself that isolation was strength, and it wasn't. It was a system with no redundancy. One person seeing everything, one person deciding everything, and anyone who could have shared the weight kept at a distance that made sharing impossible." He paused. "You built redundancy into my system without being asked to. You built it in the dark, with no authorization and no guarantee that it would ever be used, because you understood what I had built, and you could see what it was missing." She was very still. "I missed you," he said. "For 6 years. Not misplaced, missed. I looked past you on the way to the thing I thought was more important, and the thing I was looking for was in the room I didn't go into." The silence in the chamber was complete and warm, and had the specific quality of silences that have been a long time arriving. Her eyes were wet. Not spilling. She was not a woman who spilled easily, but present. The gloss of something that had been held for a long time and was deciding whether to let go. "You're late," she said. Her voice was steady and rough and true. "Yes," he said. "I know. 4 years late." "Yes. I spent 4 years in this castle learning how to need nothing from you," she said. "And I was good at it. I got very good at it." She looked at him. "I don't know how to undo that in one night, Cassian. I'm not asking you to undo it in one night. What are you asking?" He took one step toward her, then stopped. "Permission," he said, which was a word he had not used in a very long time, possibly ever, in the specific way he meant it now. Not tactical permission, not procedural clearance, but the asking of someone who understands they have no claim on the answer. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the keep, somewhere in the waking castle, the ordinary sounds of morning were reasserting themselves. Boots on stone, the creak of the gate being opened, the distant ordinary noise of people who had defended something through the night and were now beginning the work of assessing what remained. Those sounds were Blackmere at its most fundamental, not the formal ceremony or the political machinery, but the daily persistence of a place that had decided to continue. She reached out and took his hand, not dramatically, not with the weight of declaration. She simply reached out and took his hand the way you take something that has been offered and that you have decided, after examining the offer carefully, to accept. He looked at her hand in his, the ink stains, the capable fingers, the evidence of everything she had done in the time he was not paying attention. He closed his hand around hers. Teg. The formal negotiations began 3 days later. Lucian stayed a week. He and Cassian sat across the library table from each other for 6 hours on the first day, and Morn was there, and 2 of the Eastern barons who arrived by the second day, having heard what had happened, and the land grant documents were on the table, along with Seraphina's leather book and the second volume she had filled in the 3 days between the assault and the negotiations. She sat at the table, not beside Cassian as an ornament or a courtesy. At the table with her own copy of the documents and a second leather book, and when questions arose about the legal specifics of the land grant irregularity or the trade house connections or the evidence trail that documented the private network's positioning, she answered them. Precisely, without preamble, with the specificity of someone who has spent 8 months building a case specifically for this table. Lucien watched her work. On the third day during a break in the session, he stopped beside Cassian in the corridor outside the library and said quietly, "I wrote in my letter to her that I wanted to meet the person who understood the northern situation that clearly." He paused. "I understand now why she wrote to me instead of coming to you first." Cassian looked at him. "She needed someone outside the castle to understand the situation before it became a crisis," Lucian said. "She chose me because I was the only person with the authority to make the review negotiated rather than forced." He paused. "She chose correctly, but she shouldn't have needed to." He looked at Cassian steadily. "Don't make her choose around you again." Cassian held his gaze. "No," he said. "I won't." Lucien nodded once and went back into the library. The review was formally requested by Blackmere on the 5th day, in writing, with the Duke and Duchess of Blackmere both signing. The document that accompanied the request, the full analysis of the trade house network, the legal framework for a renegotiated Northern Trade Authority that preserved Blackmere's jurisdictional core while addressing the Eastern Barony's legitimate grievances, the proposed restructuring of the Pass Authority on terms that distributed the benefit more broadly, had been drafted by Seraphina over 4 days, with Cassian reading each draft and marking it and returning it, and her incorporating the markings and extending further. It was the first document they had built together. It was, in the professional assessment of every imperial legal advisor who subsequently reviewed it, the most comprehensively argued case for a northern trade restructuring that had been submitted to the imperial court in 40 years. Lucien's legal secretary spent 2 days with it and sent back a note that said simply, "Who wrote this?" Cassian sent back, "The Duchess of Blackmere." The trade house network, or the parts of it that Seraphina's documentation identified, began to come apart in the weeks that followed as the Imperial Intelligence Office worked through the money trail that Harwick's men had started pulling. 3 names emerged that sent a quiet shock through the capital's financial community. The arrests were handled with the specific imperial discretion of things that are too expensive to make entirely public. Morn was released from custody on Lucien's recommendation and returned to Ashfin with a conditional agreement and a formal acknowledgement of the losses his party had suffered. Not a restitution, not an apology from the crown, but the specific formal recognition that carries legal weight in succession disputes. It was not everything he had come for. It was more than he had expected to leave with. The new steward of Blackmere was a woman named Hara, recommended by Seraphina, formerly the head of administration in the eastern provinces. She arrived on a Tuesday in the 3rd week after the assault, assessed the castle's administrative state with the precision of someone who has seen administrative states in worse condition and worse, and began the work. The night before Lucien left, he asked Serafina to walk with him in the outer courtyard. Cassian watched them from the window of his study, not surveilling, not with the old territorial calculation that he recognized now as having been fear wearing the costume of authority. He watched them the way you watch two people you respect, and he saw the specific quality of the conversation even from a distance. Lucien talking, Serafina listening with her focused attention, then speaking, and Lucien listening in turn with the quality of someone not accustomed to being listened at rather than to. He did not need to know what they said. He knew what he knew, which was that she had written to Lucien 8 months ago because she had needed an ally and had not had one available inside these walls, and that the absence of that ally had been his absence, and that going forward the absence was over. He knew this not as a resolution or a policy, but as a fact of what he had become, which was different from what he had been. And the difference had been built over 8 specific days in which he had been broken open by a woman who kept copies of everything and visited dying villages with a frightened maid and had learned in the years of his inattention how to need nothing from him. Learning how to need nothing from someone is a survival mechanism. It is not a choice. People learn it the way the body learns to compensate for an injury, redistributing the weight, developing the capacity to function around the thing that isn't there. It works. It is also a form of damage, the invisible kind, the kind that does not announce itself because the person carrying it has gotten too good at the compensation. She had compensated for his absence for 4 years. She had become extraordinary in the space his absence created, and the extraordinary thing she had built was real and hers, and he had no claim on it and no right to it. What he could offer was something simpler than claim or right. He could offer presence, attention, the willingness to be in the room and to look at what was actually there instead of the system he had mapped and filed and stopped examining. He had not known, before 8 days ago, that this was the hardest thing a man like him could do. Harder than fighting, harder than building a trade network from a bankrupt inheritance, harder than sitting across a table from a crown prince and negotiating the legal framework for the restructuring of his own authority. Being present for another person without the buffer of management or control or the organizing principle of utility, being present for its own sake, for the sake of the person you are present for, required the one thing he had spent 20 years training out of himself: vulnerability, not weakness. Vulnerability is not weakness, though he had treated them as synonyms for long enough that unlearning the conflation was going to take time. He did not begrudge. Weakness is the failure to act. Vulnerability is the willingness to be seen. And being seen is the one thing that can be taken from you and cannot be defended against by any wall or sword or system of strategic isolation, and it is also the one thing that makes anything real. He had been not real for a long time, living inside a fortress of his own construction and calling the architecture strength. She had been real the whole time, 3 corridors away in a warm room with ink on her hands, building something she was not sure would ever be used by anyone who mattered, because building it was the right thing to do. That was, he thought, the truest thing about her. Not the intelligence, though the intelligence was formidable, and not the courage, though she had more of it than most people he had commanded. The truest thing was the consistency. She had done the right thing when it was invisible, when there was no audience and no reward and no certainty that it would ever matter. She had done it in the dark, and that was different. That required a quality of character that could not be performed or strategized. It simply was, or it wasn't. It was. He turned from the window. Mayonnaise. She came to find him that evening. He was in his study with the lamp burning and the new ledgers open, the first set of documents under the restructured Northern Authority, the numbers cleaner and the columns more honest than anything he had reviewed in years. He heard the knock and said, "Come in." And she did, and she came to stand on the other side of the desk with her hands clasped in front of her and looked at him. "Lucien is leaving tomorrow at first light," she said. "I know." "He asked me to go with him." She said it directly, without preamble, the way she said everything that mattered. It was not a personal offer. It was a formal one. He wants to establish a northern advisory position within his court, and he asked if I would consider filling it when he ascends. She paused. He said Blackmere will have a voice in the imperial court either way. He was asking whether it would be my voice. Cassian set down his pen. He looked at her standing on the other side of the desk in the lamplight, and he felt the weight of it, the specific, clean weight of a moment that was about to reveal something true. She was telling him because she would not make a decision of that magnitude without telling him. She was also, he understood with the part of him that was now paying attention, telling him because she wanted to know his answer. Not his permission. His answer. "What did you tell him?" Cassian said. "I told him I needed to have a conversation first." "This conversation?" "Yes." He stood up, came around the desk and stopped in front of her, the same 2 feet. The distance he had learned in 8 days was the distance at which they spoke honestly. "What do you want?" he said. She looked at him. The question was clearly not the one she had been bracing for, and the brief, involuntary quality of her expression, the blink, the slight parting of the lips before she collected it, told him she had prepared answers to several questions and this was not among them. "I want—" She stopped, looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "I want to stay here," she said. "That's the true answer. I want to stay here, and I want what started this week to continue, and I want to stop being invisible inside my own home." Her voice was steady and rough at the same time. "I've spent 6 years building toward something in this castle, and I am not done building it, and I don't want to leave." A pause. "But I also needed to know if you would ask me to stay, or if you would let me go because it was strategically acceptable." He looked at her. "Seraphina," he said. "Stay." Not because Blackmere needed her, though Blackmere did. Not because the advisory role she had built in 8 days was irreplaceable, though it was. Not because the Imperial Review required her continued involvement, though it did. "Stay," he said, "because I am asking you to. Because this is your home and I am done being the reason it doesn't feel like one. Because I want to know what you're building and I want to help you build it. And I want the next 6 years to be different from the last 6 in every way that can be changed by paying attention." He paused. "And because the one thing I know about myself after this week is that I'm not willing to watch you walk through those gates toward a better situation than the one I failed to give you." His voice was quiet and carried no performance. "I'm asking. You decide." The fire cracked. She looked at him for a long moment. The assessing look, the one he had learned was not calculation, but the careful examination of a person who has been disappointed before and does not extend trust lightly and has earned through that carefulness the right to take her time. Then she said, "All right." Her 4th time. 8 days and 4 times, each one meaning something different, this one meaning everything. He reached out and she came forward into his arms, and he held her in the lamplight of the study where he had sat alone for 16 years. And outside the castle walls, the northern territory was quiet for the first time in weeks, cold and frost-white and present, the roads empty, the watchtower signal silent. Blackmere was standing, not because its walls had held, though they had, not because its duke had fought through the night, though he had, not because of the formal petition that would reform the Northern Trade Authority or the legal documents that would restructure the jurisdictional framework or the Imperial Review that would legitimize what had been built on uncertain ground. Blackmere was standing because of what happened in the margins, because a woman in a warm room with maps on the walls had spent 8 months building something in the dark without an audience, and because a man had finally opened the door. That was the thing that endured, not the walls. Walls can fall. Not the legal structures, those can be renegotiated. Not the trade routes or the land grants or the carefully managed systems of power and control that a duke builds over 16 years of ruthless administration. What endured was simpler and harder and far more difficult to build than anything Cassian had constructed in 4 decades of living, the specific, irreversible fact of one person turning toward another and choosing not to look away. He had been feared by kingdoms. He had not known, until she showed him, that there was something harder than being feared, being known, and choosing, after being known, the wounds and the failures and the 4 years of invisible damage and all of it visible, to be worthy of the person who had seen it all and stayed. He was going to spend the rest of his life learning what that required. He found, standing in the lamplight with her in his arms, and the frost settling on the outer walls, and the new ledgers open on his desk, that the learning did not frighten him. It was the first thing in a long time that didn't. In the months that followed, the aristocracy whispered. They would always whisper. That was the nature of aristocracies, the endless circulation of story and assessment, and the particular obsessive interest in what the powerful chose to love. They whispered about the quiet Duchess who had dismantled a fraud network and drafted a trade reform that reshaped the empire's northern policy. They whispered about the Iron Duke who had knelt, not literally, though the story acquired that detail in its travels, to a woman 3 corridors away he had not looked at in 4 years. They whispered about Lucien, who returned to the capital and told his father's advisors, in the flat tones of someone reporting a fact, that the Duchess of Blackmere was the most capable political mind he had encountered in the Northern Territories, and that the Empire would do well to remember her name. Cassian heard the whispers and did not care. He had learned in 8 days that restructured everything he thought he knew about the shape of strength, that the thing worth protecting was not reputation. Reputation was the story other people told about you in your absence. It had uses. It was not the same as the thing itself. The thing itself was in his study every morning now, on the other side of the desk, with the leather book and the ink-stained hands and the focused attention that missed nothing. It was in the outer villages on Fridays, where her physician now went with a proper escort and returned with reports she read and acted on. It was in the ledgers that were honest for the first time in years, and in the meetings where her voice was in the room and the room was better for it. The aristocracy could keep the whispers. He had the thing itself, and the Iron Duke of Blackmere, feared by kingdoms, built from stone and silence and the deliberate suppression of every quality that made a man legible to another human being, sat across from his wife in the warm lamplight of a study that no longer felt like a fortress, and did the one thing he had spent 40 years not doing. He looked.